Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, that it enjoy.
Chapter 13. Full information. September 26th. Raccoon City. Jill's apartment. 10:20 a.m. Jill, her face still red with embarrassment, pulled on the door handle, making sure the latch, as broken as it was, at least managed to catch. She didn't dare to look at John, who, impassive, stood in the middle of her chaotic apartment. Oblivious to her shame, he dedicated himself to observing. His eyes, used to finding order in the midst of the most brutal disorder, moved slowly around the room. It wasn't just a mess, it was a warrior's mess. On the living room table, next to the remains of the coffee table, was a map of Raccoon City, splattered with markers and notes in a personal code. One of the windows was slightly ajar, with an improvised lookout point. The kitchen drawers, wide open, revealed not only utensils but also ammunition and grenades, carefully labeled with color markers. In one corner, on a chair, was a shotgun. It didn't look like a home, but a base of operations, a nest for survival. John noticed something else. There was a palpable loneliness in the air, a sadness that emanated from Jill's personal belongings. The family photos, the memories she had set aside, were covered with a layer of dust. John saw a trace of a life that had been left behind, of a woman who had been forced to become a ghost. Jill wasn't running, she was waiting. Waiting for an end, whether it was death or victory. And in the silence of that disorder, John felt a respect for her. Finally, Jill dared to look at him. Her face was red, but her expression was no longer one of embarrassment, but of frustration. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Peterson, sometimes she's too much." John, with his deep voice, interrupted her. "Don't apologize. It's a misunderstanding. I get it." "No, you don't," Jill insisted, her eyes fixed on the floor. "She thinks, well, that you're my boyfriend." An imperceptible smile appeared at the corner of John's lips. A smile that wasn't for amusement but a slight, bitter acknowledgement of the situation's irony. John, who had spent his days killing and evading death, was now being mistaken for a suitor. "John," he introduced himself, holding out his hand, with a movement as fluid as his gun. "My name is John." Jill, still with a flushed face, shook his hand. The touch of his fingers, cold and firm, was a reminder that John wasn't a police officer or a civilian. He was a professional, like her. "Jill Valentine," she replied, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. "Jill," John said, his voice calm and emotionless, "we have a problem. And it's not your neighbor." Jill's eyes became serious. The embarrassment and dark humor disappeared, replaced by a seriousness that John recognized immediately. "The police officer outside is unconscious," John continued, his voice low and emotionless. "Your door is smashed in. At any moment, someone could come to investigate. We have to hide the body, and we have to talk. Now." Jill nodded, her mind already in combat mode. She was no longer the embarrassed woman, but the STARS member who had fought against the T-virus. "Yes," she said, "let's do it." With a silent synchronicity, John and Jill left the room. John dragged the unconscious police officer by the legs, while Jill, with the strength that adrenaline gave her, lifted him by the shoulders. No words were needed. John nodded toward the kitchen door, and together, they took him inside. With a rope that Jill took from one of the drawers, they tied him to a chair. The officer, still unconscious, didn't resist. With a cloth covering his face, the man was now just another obstacle in the mission. "Now, the conversation," John said, returning to the living room. His gaze, cold and penetrating, was fixed on Jill. "Tell me what you know about Umbrella." Jill, who was busy picking up the remains of the coffee table, stopped. Her gaze, full of resentment, met his. "Why are you asking? Who are you? Are you from a covert agency? The feds?" John didn't answer immediately. His silence was an answer in itself. Jill understood. He was neither one nor the other. "Umbrella killed someone I cared about," John replied, his voice low and emotionless. "I want to kill them all." John's words were simple, but the fury they hid was palpable. Jill felt it, she understood it. It was the same feeling that had consumed her since she had discovered the truth about Umbrella. "I understand," Jill said, her voice a murmur but filled with a contained rage. "Umbrella, they are responsible for all of this. For the dead, for those monsters I call zombies." Jill told John everything. The mission at the mansion, the discovery of the T-virus, Wesker's betrayal, and how the corporation had managed to hide its guilt. John listened attentively, his face impassive, his eyes fixed on hers, unblinking. Every detail she gave him, every name she spoke, was absorbed by him. After Jill finished speaking, John paused. A long pause that made the tension in the apartment almost unbearable. When I arrived in Raccoon City, my goal was to find a refuge, a quiet place. Something that would give me some peace. But after 2 days, I heard a rumor, John began, his voice barely audible. The gunsmith, at his shop, the kendo shop, told me that something strange, something dirty, was brewing in a church. I didn't know anything about viruses, nothing about Umbrella. Just that it was a complicated place. The kendo shop, Jill interrupted, her eyes wide. I know Robert Kendo, he's a good friend. He told you that? John nodded, his gaze emotionless. Yes, and I went to investigate. I found her in the basement of that church, an innocent girl with blonde hair and a youthful face, tied up. A man, Father Ben, was about to inject her with something. I saved her, or at least, I thought so. I thought that with my intervention, nothing would happen to her. John's voice cracked for an instant, a glimpse of pain that vanished as quickly as it appeared. But the needle had already touched her skin, he continued, his voice returning to its usual tone, cold as ice. I saw her transform in an instant. From a human being to a wild beast. Her eyes, for a brief glimpse, I saw Sarah. She pleaded with me, begged me to kill her. I didn't recognize her. She was a creature, without logic. Only in that final second, she asked me to kill her. And I did. Jill was stunned. The story left her breathless, her own fury at what Umbrella was capable of doing mixed with a feeling of helplessness. A church, a place of worship, Jill said, her voice full of indignation. No, it can't be. They have no respect for anything, not for life, not for sacred places. Jill's rage at what Umbrella had done mixed with a somber curiosity. And that Father Ben, and the others who were there. What happened to them? I killed them, John replied simply, as if he were talking about the weather. The coldness of his voice, the ease with which he uttered those words, sent a shiver down Jill's spine. The man felt no remorse. Only a brutal coldness. And, how did you find out I was here? Jill asked, trying to understand the context of everything that was happening. No one knew I was under surveillance. In the first few days in Raccoon City, I went to the police station to get a map of the city, John replied, his voice monotonous. I heard that a police officer, a certain Jill Valentine, was being detained in her apartment. She was under surveillance. Then, some Umbrella agents chased me after I had saved Sarah. I led them to an alley, and before they could do anything, I killed everyone, leaving only the leader, who gave me the necessary information, with a bit of stimulation. Stimulation, Jill said, her voice a whisper. Haven't they sent anyone after you? Haven't they pursued you? John, with a logic that chilled Jill's blood, smiled for an instant, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've killed every person who has linked me to Umbrella. I don't leave loose ends. The revelation surprised Jill a little. She realized that this man, with his stone face and monotonous voice, was the only person who understood the hell she was going through. So, you're in this to kill them, Jill said. For revenge. And I'm in this to expose them. To let the whole world know what they did. John, with a look in his eyes that was a mixture of sadness and rage, nodded. Exactly, he said, but to expose them, we'll have to kill them first. Jill fell silent, processing the brutality of John's story. The stimulation he had mentioned, the coldness with which he spoke of killing his pursuers, this was not a police officer, not a federal agent, he was something completely different. A predator that hunted other predators. Her mind, still rattled by the revelation, couldn't help but be surprised by the calmness with which John spoke of violence. To him, it was as simple as breathing. His brutality was his logic, his code of honor. Suddenly, an idea ignited in her mind. She remembered one of the news reports she had heard this morning on the radio before the signal was completely cut off. The police station, the reporters, everyone was talking about a pattern of strange deaths and a devastating fire at an Umbrella pharmacy warehouse on the outskirts of the city. She turned to John with a look that was no longer one of shock, but of a new and cautious curiosity. The news, this morning, they've been reporting deaths in the area. And a fire at an Umbrella pharmacy warehouse. Was that you? John, who was standing in the middle of the room with his arms crossed, didn't blink. Yes, he replied, his voice as monotonous as the air conditioning. And were all the people who died Umbrella agents? Jill asked, almost out of breath, as if she feared the answer. Everyone, except for a group of thugs in a warehouse, John replied calmly. The rest were linked to Umbrella. Jill, despite everything she had seen, was stunned. The ease with which John spoke of killing 20 people left her speechless. It was as if he were talking about getting a coffee. Silence took over the room again, but this time, Jill filled it with her own thoughts. Unconsciously, her mind went to a place she had tried to avoid since the nightmare had begun. Brad Vickers, her partner. He was also in the city, but he seemed to have vanished, not answering calls, not showing up to help anyone. Coward, Jill thought, the word felt bitter in her mouth. Like that time at the mansion. He abandoned us, he left us to our fate. Jill realized that John, despite his brutality and lack of remorse, was more than Brad Vickers had been in a long time. He was a man of action, a man who didn't hide, a man who didn't abandon others. Jill felt a strange respect for John. Yes, he was a killer. But he was a killer who had killed to save a girl, who had fought against a corporation that had ruined his own life. And, somehow, that made her feel less alone. We have to get out of here, John said, his voice interrupting the flow of Jill's thoughts. Before the other police officers start looking for their partner. It's a waste of time. We're exposing ourselves. Jill nodded, her mind already in planning mode. You're right, but where are we going? By now, everyone will be looking for me around the city. As much as I'm armed, it's better to be invisible to the enemy. John stared at her. I'm at the Raccoon City Hotel. The room next to mine is empty. I'll be willing to pay for the room for a few nights. Jill considered the idea for a moment. An ironic smile formed on her lips. My apartment is already quite wrecked, thanks to our little misunderstanding. And you've already knocked out an officer who was watching me. It would be stupid to stay. Her gaze softened. I accept. John nodded, moving to help her gather her things. Good. The less. Just as he bent down to lift one of the boxes, the officer who was tied up with his tie in a corner of the room began to stir, groaning and with his eyes half open. John and Jill looked at each other, the newly formed alliance about to be tested for the first time. The tied-up officer on the floor began to moan, shaking his head with a dazed movement. John, with the stillness of a predator seeing its prey awaken, slid his hand toward his suit. His fingers were already brushing against the grip of his pistol. The logic was simple. A witness was a problem. A witness who could identify him was a problem to be eliminated. No, Jill exclaimed, stepping between John and the officer. She put a hand on John's arm, her palm facing outward, with a firm gesture. Lower your weapon. John looked at her. His eyes, cold and emotionless, met Jill's. Why? He asked, his voice as monotonous as marble. If we leave him alive, he can say what I look like. This is unnecessary. Not everyone works for Umbrella, Jill retorted, in a firm tone of voice with a hint of frustration. Yes, he's a police officer. But that doesn't mean he knows what's going on at Umbrella. Brian Irons is the perfect pawn for that corporation, but this man, he's just doing his job. John frowned. His eyes moved from the dazed officer to Jill's. After a long moment of silence, his hand moved slowly, releasing the weapon and putting it back in his suit. Jill exhaled a sigh of relief that she hadn't even known she was holding. Good. Wait, I'll change and get what I need. I'll be ready in a minute, Jill said, and she hurried into her room, closing the door with a soft click. John was left alone with the officer. Jill's words echoed in his mind. Was she a stupid woman or was she right? It wasn't a question he would have cared about before. But now, with her in his way, the rules of the game had changed. He quickly shook those thoughts out of his head. He couldn't kill him, but at least he could take what was useful to him. He approached the officer, who still had the cloth on his face, and took his gun and radio. He put the pistol in his suit, then turned on the radio out of curiosity. Several routine voices filled the air. Unit 7 to 4, do you copy? Over. This is Unit 4, I copy. What do you need? Over and out. Unit 7, just a routine check. All quiet in Sector 4. John was about to turn it off when a new voice interrupted the chat, a voice that seemed to be the officer's partner. Brad, Unit 20, do you copy? I've been calling you for a while. Everything okay over there? Over. John cursed inwardly. The voice was persistent, full of concern. He didn't respond, immediately turned off the radio, and put it in his inner pocket. It was a valuable tool, a source of information in case things got ugly. With a new sense of urgency, he headed to Jill's bedroom door and knocked several times. "Jill, hurry up, the cops downstairs are starting to get suspicious. We need to go now." "Almost ready," Jill shouted from the other side, her voice muffled by the door. John grew desperate. He thought of the different ways to escape without being seen, but the shadow of Jill and her words got in the way of his thoughts. It seemed that killing all the police officers was no longer an option. While he waited, John's mind worked at a frantic pace, a machine calculating risks and escape solutions. If the police officers downstairs came up to check, he wouldn't have many options. Going unnoticed would be almost impossible, unless they were just a couple of agents. If they arrived in a group, the situation would become a massacre. And with Jill by his side, the massacre became a complication. He couldn't kill them all and get out of there as if nothing had happened. Jill's words echoed in his head, complicating his single instinct. He had to think of an alternative, a momentary hiding place. Could there be another empty apartment that Jill knew about? It was the most viable option, but he didn't have time to find out. The other option was riskier, but it could work, asking Jill to talk to a neighbor and invent an excuse to stay in her apartment for a while. But that would require perfect coordination, one that depended on a factor he controlled. The police officer's radio. It was the only way to know the exact moment the agents would come up. The radio he had saved was his only advantage. The only way to know if the police had arrived in the lobby, if they were already in the elevators, if they had set out. It was his only way to know how much time he had left to devise an escape plan without leaving a trail of corpses. Just then, Jill's bedroom door opened. John's thoughts came to a halt, replaced by a silent observation. Jill looked as ready for combat as John himself. She wore her iconic capri blue tank top with a white shirt underneath. Her legs were covered by gray-blue jeans, the top end of which was folded and unbuttoned, ready for battle. A dark blue shoulder holster crossed her torso, with her iconic STARS Beretta in place. On her back, a backpack seemed to be full of urgent provisions. She looked like a woman prepared for war, one who refused to be a victim. "I'm ready," she said in a firm and determined voice. John nodded, but his eyes didn't leave her. With that outfit, it would be impossible to go unnoticed, but his mind was already working on a new strategy. They would have to be fast. Chapter 14. The Alliance is formed. September 26th, Raccoon City, Jill's apartment. 10:45 a.m. "I'm ready," she said in a firm, determined voice. John nodded, but his eyes never left her. Dressed like that, it would be impossible for her to go unnoticed, but his mind was already working on a new strategy. They would have to be quick. He approached her. His voice, a deep whisper, cut through the air like a knife. "There are 2 cops downstairs, and they've noticed the one who was here is missing. They're coming up, it's only a matter of minutes." Jill's gaze hardened. "Understood. What's the plan?" "There are 2 options," John said, his voice emotionless, but the urgency was clear. "The first is deception. We need a neighbor to cover for us, we'll make up an excuse to buy time. The second is more drastic. If they detect us, I'll have to deal with them, but that will leave a trail that will complicate our escape." He pointed to his waist. "I'm going to turn on the radio. I need to know how much time we have." A static murmur filled the air as John fiddled with the device. The voices of 2 men became audible. "He's still not answering. Where did this bum go? He left the radio on. He's not answering. Something's wrong. Maybe he just went for a walk. We'll go check. He left the radio on like an idiot." John turned off the radio. "They've given us little time," he said, the urgency in his voice becoming more tangible. "They're on their way." Jill nodded, a little embarrassed, but with a determined look on her face. "I only know Mrs. Peterson. She lives 2 doors down." "Perfect. The excuse is this. I'm taking her to a very fancy place, and she forgot her long coat. We'll tell her we need to borrow one." John pulled out a wad of cash and held it in his hand. "This should be enough to convince her." Jill nodded, and the 2 moved quickly toward Mrs. Peterson's door. John guided her, his eyes scanning the hallway, his ears alert. A faint sound, the sound of shoe soles on the stairs, reached his ears. John stopped. "They're coming," he whispered, the urgency now clear. "Now." Jill knocked on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again, more urgently. The door opened, and an elderly woman with gray hair and curious eyes looked at her. "Oh, but look who's here," exclaimed Mrs. Peterson, her eyes sparkling as she saw the two of them. A mischievous smile spread across her wrinkled face. Well, well, you two lovebirds. Where are you off to looking so smart at this time of the morning? Jill, her face completely red, tried to speak. Mrs. Peterson, it's not what you think, he didn't. John, unfazed by the interruption or the insinuation, stepped forward, cutting off Jill's apology. He held the wad of bills in front of Mrs. Peterson. Sorry to rush you, ma'am. My friend needs a long coat. I'm taking her somewhere fancy, but she forgot hers. This is an apology for the inconvenience. Mrs. Peterson saw the bills and her eyes widened, her smile broadening and becoming more knowing. Oh, of course, dear. How nice of you. Come in, come in. It's obvious you're more than friends. There's no need to hide it. Jill and John entered, and the door closed behind them. John turned to Jill, his eyes reflecting the calm after the storm. Now for the hardest part. Waiting. Just as the door closed, John heard the faint sound of footsteps on the stairs. He approached the door and pressed his ear against the wood, listening to the sound of shoe soles. They were coming up. They were close. They're here, he whispered. We've got them, just for a few seconds. The seconds that followed felt like hours. Jill, her nerves on edge, paced back and forth in the small space, her hands clasped and her eyes fixed on the door. John, on the other hand, stood motionless, glued to the door like a statue. In less than 30 seconds, the footsteps that had been heard on the stairs grew louder, closer, indicating that they were now on their floor. Just as John moved away from the door to stand next to Jill, Mrs. Peterson reappeared, a nostalgic expression on her face. She was wearing a gray coat, very neat and elegant, and a black fedora hat, which seemed to have been well preserved. This coat was mine when I was a little younger, she said, her voice soft and full of memories. And this hat, this was my late husband's favorite. Mrs. Peterson smiled, a sincere smile that made her look younger. I'm giving them to you both because they remind me of us when we were young. Jill felt the heat rise to her face, completely embarrassed by the situation. Oh, no, Mrs. Peterson, I can't accept this, she murmured, her eyes darting from the coat to the hat. It's too valuable. I could take something else. I don't want to cause you any trouble. Nonsense, insisted the old woman with an affectionate smile. There isn't another one. Besides, this one will fit you perfectly. Accept these gifts, they are my most precious memories. Before Jill could argue further, John intervened with his deep voice. Thank you very much, Mrs. Peterson. You are very kind, but we have to go. The car is waiting for us, we'll be late for the restaurant. Jill understood the warning. The word, restaurant, was a code, a sign that the police were about to arrive and time was running out. Reluctantly, she took her coat and buttoned it up quickly, while John put on his hat, adjusting it on his head. Mrs. Peterson looked at them with a smile of pure happiness. You look beautiful, she exclaimed, her eyes shining with pride. You look like a Hollywood couple. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, Jill said quickly, her voice tinged with embarrassment. But we're not, we're just. Before she could finish her sentence, John opened the door slightly, his eyes focused on the hallway. He could see two police officers, dark blue uniforms and caps, entering Jill's apartment. It was the perfect moment to leave. Jill, seeing the urgency in John's eyes, fell silent. Denial could wait. Survival was the priority. With a quick movement, they said goodbye to Mrs. Peterson, who smiled at them as if they were her own grandchildren. Bye, sweetie, bye, sir, she called as the door closed. They moved with the silent efficiency of two predators. John was the first out, with Jill right behind him, their footsteps light on the wooden floor. A quick glance down the hallway. The cops were already in Jill's apartment, the door half open, the sound of their voices muffled by the walls. They descended the stairs at a fast but controlled pace, a 3-story descent that felt like a sprint. When they reached the building's entrance, the lobby was completely empty. John didn't waste a second. He moved quickly, his figure elegant and dark in his hat, the silhouette of a ghost. Jill followed him, feeling the cool air of the street hit her face. Finally outside, she whispered, relief flooding her voice. We're not out yet, John replied, not turning his head, his eyes scanning the street, the passing cars and pedestrians. The tone of his voice was a warning. Jill nodded, her brief moment of calm evaporating as quickly as it had arrived. They walked in silence, tension hanging between them. They had covered a couple of blocks when John stopped. Jill stopped too, looking at him, waiting for an explanation. We can't risk walking any further, he said, his voice a low whisper. Someone might recognize you. A cop, an umbrella agent. We're a moving target. Jill nodded, her mind racing to analyze his logic. He was right. On foot, they were vulnerable. Her face was familiar, her name notorious. In the taxi, they would be just another couple in the vast city. It was the smartest and quickest choice. John raised his hand, and a yellow taxi pulled up in front of them. John opened the door and motioned for Jill to get in. To the Raccoon Hotel, the service entrance. The taxi driver nodded, and John got into the car, slamming the door shut. Inside, the silence was different, less tense. The tension had turned into an uneasy calm. Jill looked at John's figure beside her, the dim street light reflecting off his stylish hat, the shadow it cast over his face, hiding his eyes. It made him look even more handsome, more mysterious. Her mind wandered for a moment, and all she could think about was how good he looked. She realized she was staring at him too much and, feeling her cheeks flush, turned her head away in embarrassment. The situation was ridiculous. She still hadn't come to terms with the fact that there was a murderer sitting next to her, a man who looked like he had stepped out of a movie. She forced herself to focus on the street, but the faint sound of the engine and the faint smell of gasoline couldn't drown out the sound of her own heart beating. When the taxi stopped, Jill got out first, her feet touching the asphalt. The hotel, an imposing Gothic-style building, stood before them. It was a familiar place for her, the site of several STARS meetings before the city turned into hell. John got out of the car after her, a $100 bill in his hand. "Keep the change," he said, his voice deep, the figure of a busy businessman. The taxi driver, with a dazzling smile, nodded and drove away. They entered through the service entrance, which led them directly to the reception area, a brightly lit lobby decorated with antique furniture. Next to them, the counter was made of polished, shiny mahogany, and a middle-aged receptionist greeted them with a friendly smile. "Mr. Wick," said the receptionist, his voice low and respectful. "It's a pleasure to have you back." "The pleasure is mine," John replied, his voice as polite as the receptionist's. The receptionist glanced sideways at Jill, his gaze lingering for a second on the girl wearing the long coat. Jill, her heart pounding, tried to maintain her composure. She felt as if she were being scanned, as if the receptionist could see everything going on in her head. "I'd like to pay for the room next to mine," John said. "For the young lady?" asked the receptionist, his gaze still on Jill. John nodded. "Yes, and I'd like to pay for 10 nights. That's how long she'll be staying." The receptionist smiled, the warmth in his eyes returning. "My pleasure, Mr. Wick. It's an honor." John handed him the money, and the receptionist took it with an elegant gesture, slipping it into a drawer. Jill, feeling as if she were acting in a play, could only nod. Her mind was confused, but her instinct told her not to ask questions, just to follow John. Naturally, she positioned herself behind him, imitating his gait, his calm demeanor. The receptionist watched them leave, his polite smile fading into one of confusion. "Another girl," he thought to himself. Mr. Wick doesn't beat around the bush. 1 night is one thing, but 10, he must be really into this. "And I haven't seen the other girl again," the one who seemed quite shy. A sigh he didn't know he was holding escaped his lips as he marked John's room as occupied. Without saying a word, John led Jill across the lobby. With every step they took, the girl felt more uncomfortable. She felt as if they were being watched, as if there was silent scrutiny in every person who crossed their path. She looked at John, but he walked at his slow, steady pace, his face expressionless, as if he were walking through his own home. Jill forced herself to calm down and walk with the same poise, to pretend that the silence didn't bother her. In her mind, John was ignoring the silence and the stares. He was too busy processing the information Jill had given him. Umbrella, the pharmaceutical corporation. The same one that had been in charge of the mansion disaster. A plot to silence witnesses to their illegal experiments. It had to be. It was the only reason why a group like STARS had been disbanded and its members hunted down. John's plan was simple: find Umbrella's base in the city and take them down. If they had a main target, it was probably the base of operations itself. He could use Jill's information to attack, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed Jill's help, as she knew the city and, more importantly, the Umbrella organization. They reached a long hallway. John stopped in front of a door, number 201. He turned to Jill, his voice a low whisper, filling the silence. "This is your room." He pointed to the door next door, 202. Mine is here. If you need anything, I'm just a few steps away. Then his voice grew firmer. Once you're settled in, knock on my door. I have an idea for attacking another of Umbrella's possible bases. Jill nodded, her mind returning to the mission. The discomfort she had felt had vanished, replaced by renewed determination. Understood. I won't be long. With that promise, Jill entered her room, closing the door behind her. She felt like a soldier returning to her post, ready for a new mission. John turned and headed for door 202. He opened the door with his key, entered the room, and closed it behind him with a soft click. The room was a standard hotel suite, with a large bed and a window overlooking the street. He ignored the luxury, his eyes resting on the small backpack he was carrying. He placed it on the bed and opened it. With precise movements, he took out a pistol he had taken from the policeman he had tied up. He examined it carefully, his fingers running over the cold metal. The pistol, a Beretta 92FS, was a common model, but in John's hands, it became a lethal tool. He checked the magazine, the weight, and the feel of the weapon. After a thorough inspection, he stowed it in a compartment of his backpack, where other weapons were already stored, each one packed with meticulous precision. Once the weapons were in place, he got up and went to a small refrigerator in the room. He took out 2 slices of bread and cheese and a bottle of water. With the speed of a chef, he made himself a quick sandwich. Hunger was a strange sensation, a reminder of the life he had left behind, a simple instinct he couldn't ignore. As he bit into the sandwich, his eyes fell on the map of the city he had taken out of his backpack. The map, a detailed replica of Raccoon City, was spread out on the coffee table. His mind, a maze of plans and strategies, processed Jill's information. The Umbrella Laboratory, the place where the virus had originated. The data the girl had given him was enough to plot a route, a strategy to get in undetected. His gaze lingered on the location of the school. I should go, he thought. It was a place where the infection could have spread, a place that the Umbrella Corporation could be using to experiment on children, something that made him frown, and a small image popped into his mind, that of a child being turned into a monster like Sarah had become. He finished his sandwich in seconds and took a sip of water. He was ready. His mind, clear and determined, had no time for rest. Now, he just had to wait for Jill to be ready. Silence filled John Wick's suite as he waited. It wasn't an unsettling silence, but the kind of calm that precedes a storm. It was a silence he knew well, one that was only broken by the sound of his own thoughts. He finished his sandwich, his hunger satisfied, but his thirst for knowledge and a clear plan was insatiable. His eyes followed the map of Raccoon City, a network of streets, alleys, and buildings that had now become a battlefield. The location of the school, a possible second Umbrella laboratory, stood out like a red dot in his mind. It was a logical place for a second assault. Suddenly, a soft knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. The sound was a familiar echo, the same one he had heard in his own home before everything went to hell. He rose with his usual movement, his figure silent, his footsteps light on the carpet. John, he heard Jill's voice on the other side of the door. I'm ready. Without hesitation, he approached the door, unlocked it, and the door opened with a soft click. Jill entered, her figure gliding into the room, her eyes, filled with a mixture of embarrassment and urgency, resting on him. He immediately noticed that she had removed the coat Mrs. Peterson had given her, revealing her combat outfit, the iconic capri blue tank top with a white blouse underneath. Her legs were covered by grayish-blue jeans, the top of which were rolled up and unbuttoned. Jill's gaze swept across the room, her eyes stopping at the coffee table, where the map of Raccoon City lay spread out like a spider's web. John, without saying a word, gestured her to the table. Sit down, he said, his voice calm and deep. Jill sat down in the chair across from the small table, her eyes fixed on the map. So, the plan is to use the map to attack another Umbrella base? She asked, trying to break the silence. Her voice was casual, almost too casual. The awkwardness was palpable, but her curiosity overcame it. It's better to talk on a full stomach, John replied, his voice calm, as he returned from the small refrigerator. He approached the table, not with a map, but with a plate holding 2 sandwiches and a couple of glasses of orange juice. Jill was surprised. Her eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and relief spreading across her face. She hadn't expected a sandwich, or juice, or even a meal. She had expected a tactic, a plan, maybe even an order. Not an act of kindness, a show of care amid the chaos. John set the plate on the table, gently pushing it toward her. Here. Thank you, Jill said, her voice a whisper. Her stomach, which had been crying out for food for hours, growled. She took a sandwich and took a bite, the taste of cheese and bread filling her mouth. John, meanwhile, took a seat across from her, his eyes fixed on the map. Now, let's talk. The calmness of his voice, the tranquility with which he ate, made Jill feel more at ease. As Jill ate quietly, her thoughts became clearer. The sandwich was not just food, it was a symbol of the alliance that had formed between them. Chapter 15. School, September 26th, Raccoon City, Police Department, 11:30 a.m. The smell of stale coffee and tobacco permeated the office of Brian Irons, the police chief of Raccoon City. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, illuminating the dust floating in the air. But Irons paid no attention to the light. His gaze, filled with a mixture of anger and frustration, was fixed on the officer sitting across from his desk. The officer, a young man in his 20s with a look of bewilderment on his face, had a terrible headache. His bandaged head rested on his hands, and his voice, a whisper, was difficult to hear. The scene was the same as he had imagined, the end of one long day and the beginning of another. But this one was different. Tell me again, officer, Irons said, her voice leaving no room for doubt. Describe the man who attacked you. The officer raised his head, his gaze pained, but his eyes reflected a fear he couldn't hide. Chief, I already told you. It was a flash. I didn't see him. You didn't see him, but he attacked you and knocked you unconscious, Irons insisted, his voice growing louder. Don't give me that nonsense, officer. Tell me the truth. The officer cowered, his eyes filled with fear. Chief, I'm not lying. I just felt a kick and passed out. I didn't have time to see his face. I just remember he was wearing a suit, an elegant black suit. Irons stood up, his fist crashing into the desk. The echo of the blow filled the silence. The officer shuddered. A man in an elegant black suit. What utter nonsense, Irons shouted, his face red with anger. The police have been watching her for a week, and suddenly, a man in a suit takes her away without anyone seeing him. The officer remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. Irons paced around the desk, his mind, a maze of plans and conspiracies, processing the information. The officer was right, the door to Jill's apartment was smashed, the trail of entry was clear, and the only person who could have done that to a man was someone who knew the body's weak points, a professional. And Jill Valentine, Irons asked, his voice now calm, too calm. No one saw her, not the cops in the hallway, not the ones on the street, not the cameras. She vanished into thin air. She disappeared. The officer remained silent. Irons, fury returned. She didn't leave alone. Someone helped her. How do you explain that? The fact that Jill Valentine had escaped was a problem, but that someone had helped her was a disaster. The Umbrella Corporation didn't mess around, and anyone who got in the way of their plans would end up in the same place as the witnesses at the mansion. Dead. Just then, the door opened and another officer peeked in. Boss, we have the pharmacy employee who was attacked. He says the man was acting strangely. Irons waved his hand, motioning for him to come in. The employee, a skinny young man with glasses, entered and sat down in the chair the previous officer had occupied. His face was pale, his hands trembling. Tell me what happened at the pharmacy, Irons said, his voice in a tone the clerk had never heard before. I was at the register, stammered the employee. And a man approached. He said his stomach hurt, that he needed medicine. He knelt down, doubled over. He seemed to be in pain. When I saw he was suffering so much, I went out to help him. I bent down to help him up, and the man, he had a gun, he had it hidden in his suit. He pulled it out and hit me over the head with it, and I passed out. The employee paused, his eyes filled with shame. When I woke up, the pharmacy was on fire, and luckily I wasn't inside. Irons looked at him with narrowed eyes. The anger had faded, replaced by a dangerous coldness. Panic seized him, but he didn't show it. His mind, a maze of plans and conspiracies, processed the information. The officer described a man in an elegant black suit, and the pharmacy employee, who had just entered, described a man in a suit. Both men had described him as someone in a suit. Irons rose from his chair, his mind, a maze of plans and conspiracies, processing the information. The door to Jill's apartment was smashed, the trail from the entrance was clear, and the only person who could have done that to a man was someone who knew the body's weak points, a professional. A professional, a man in a suit. Irons had to find him before the man did more damage. The policeman's statement wasn't a lie, it was a puzzle. And the police chief, a man who believed himself to be at the top of the food chain, suddenly realized there was a new player on the board. A player who didn't follow the rules, a player who moved in the shadows, a player who wasn't afraid to die. Send all available officers out onto the street, Irons ordered, his voice now clear and concise. I want that man, dead or alive. I want to know who he is and why he's trespassing on my turf. The officer nodded, got up from his chair, and left. Silence returned to Irons' office. But this time, the silence was not reassuring. It was the silence of a predator who had realized that his prey had escaped. Irons sat down at his desk, and his eyes fell on a photo of himself. Irons' face twisted into a grimace of fury. Umbrella's conspiracy, the one to keep the secret, was in danger. And the only way to save it was to kill the person who threatened it. And the man in the suit was the biggest threat he had ever faced. With obvious nervousness, Irons rose from his chair, his trembling hand reaching for the phone and dialing a number with the tip of a single finger, as if the simple act of dialing could give him away. The phone rang once before being answered. Irons, you better have useful news. This is not a courtesy call, said a deep, sharp voice on the other end of the line. It was the voice of an important man, someone who had no time for explanations. We've had a problem at the laboratory, and you know it. I need to know what's going on. The corporation can't afford any more disasters. Irons swallowed hard. Sir, believe me, I'm on it. We've had a setback, but I know what it is, he said, his voice trembling. It's a man in an elegant black suit. A professional, a very good one. A suit, a professional, is that all you've got, Irons? We have operatives all over the city, and they haven't picked up anyone matching that description. You're no use to me if you don't know what we're dealing with. The voice hardened, the tone of anger clear. We had to get rid of the security cameras that had been tampered with, and the pharmacy cameras too. The fire reduced everything to ashes. We have no trace of this man. Sir, the pharmacy cameras were completely destroyed. We recovered them to view the videos, but everything was completely burned. You can't see anything, said Irons, the panic in his voice evident. And that's why I'm calling you, Irons. I need you to explain to me how a man could do that without anyone seeing him, and without leaving a trace. Sir, believe me, I'm doing everything I can. We're going to find him. We just need a little more time. I'm going to deploy all the officers we have to find him. We have no idea who he is, or whether he's acting on his own or for another group, but my people are already searching all over the city for him. We don't have a little more time. There isn't any. Call me back when you have his body, not before. The voice on the other end of the line abruptly hung up without saying goodbye. Irons lowered the phone from his ear, his hand trembling with impotent rage. Irons sat back down, sweating. He knew his job depended on finding this man, the professional in the black suit. Damn it, if only the security cameras hadn't burned out, we might have found something. September 26th, Raccoon City, John's hotel room, 12:15 p.m. The silence in the small room was tense, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioner. John, now impeccably dressed and with unwavering concentration, studied a map of the city he had found on the hotel desk. His gaze was a puzzle, his eyes moving from street to street, his fingers tracing imaginary paths. Jill, sitting on the edge of the bed, watched him cautiously. The time for hiding was over. Are you sure the school is the place to start? Jill asked, her voice breaking the silence, low and cautious. There are many umbrella locations in Raccoon City, and if the guy at the pharmacy was right, we could be walking into a trap. John let out a sigh, a deep, heavy sound that indicated exhaustion. He put the map down on the table and leaned back in his chair, watching Jill. Normally, John began, his voice deep, a low murmur. Normally, I would wait. I would take my time, gather information. The best way to get information is to be part of the staff, to infiltrate, to observe. But I don't have the patience for a chess game when the pawns are already falling. John leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. His gaze, a mixture of determination and annoyance, fixed on her. The man at the pharmacy said something. There was a nursing home in the school. He said they were both under the direction of a Dr. William Birkin. I don't know who he is, I don't care, but it gives me a bad feeling. I don't know why, and if I have to start somewhere, the school is the best place. Something tells me this guy is important, and the way to find him is to go to his workplace. Jill nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on his. She understood the logic. It wasn't the logic of a cop, it was the logic of a hunter. Dr. Birkin, a new name on her radar. You're right, Jill said, her voice a whisper, but full of determination. If it helps, I know how to get there. The fastest and safest way to get to the school is by subway. It's a maze, but I can guide you. The entrance is a few blocks from here. The map was still on the table, the decision made. The school was the target, and the subway was the way. John stood up, his movement quick and precise, and walked over to his suitcase open on a chair. He paused and looked at Jill, who was still sitting on the bed. You can't go dressed like that, John said, his voice a deep murmur. His gaze was not on her clothes, but on her silhouette, her posture, every little detail that made her stand out. Too visible. You're an ex-cop. The police, and anyone else who's looking for us, will know what you look like. Jill sighed, resignation weighing on her like a blanket. She understood the logic, but that didn't make her like it. She had spent the last hour arguing with the man about his suspicions and the logic of going to school, and now she had to deal with her outfit. What do you want me to wear? Jill asked, her voice a murmur of annoyance. John walked over to the door and pointed to a gray bundle, a large coat and a travel bag he had picked up from Mrs. Peterson's room. This coat, it's from an old lady. No one will pay any attention to you. And the bag to hold your equipment. Jill got out of bed, shuffling toward the door. I'll look like a grandmother, she complained, her voice a low murmur of disgust. She took the gray coat and put it on over her uniform. It was large, uncomfortable, and made her look round, almost shapeless. John ignored her complaint, his gaze resting on the gun she wore at her waist. Take that gun off. You'll carry the equipment in the bag. It's too obvious. Jill nodded, her face a mask of resignation. She unbuckled the gun belt and, with a sigh, stowed it in the travel bag she had also grabbed. The bag was as big as the coat and weighed a ton. Can we go now? She asked, the annoyance in her voice evident. Yes, John replied with a nod. John and Jill left the hotel into the blinding midday light. The receptionist, a man with an expression of resignation etched on his face, watched them pass. Unperturbed by the unusual couple, he simply nodded in their direction, a silent and respectful greeting, as if he understood that they were no ordinary guests. On the street, Jill took the lead. The afternoon sun bathed the sidewalks, and the air was heavy and thick. John followed close behind, his gaze, accustomed to detecting danger, scanning the crowd, the passing cars, and the alleys. His mind was a repository of dangers, and in Raccoon City, every shadow was a potential predator. The subway station is only 2 blocks away, Jill said, without looking back. Her voice, a low whisper, was a guide in the bustle of the city. The large coat made her look like an anonymous figure among the people, and John felt relieved. It was the perfect plan. As they walked, John saw a small newsstand, almost hidden in the shadow of a building. On the counter, several pairs of sunglasses glinted in the bright light. The decision was instantaneous. Without hesitation, John stopped Jill. Wait a minute, he said. Jill stopped, her annoyed expression growing. Now what? John didn't answer her. Instead, he walked toward the kiosk. Jill followed, her footsteps dragging on the pavement. The vendor, a man with a big smile, greeted them enthusiastically. Sir, looking for an accessory for your beautiful girlfriend? I recommend these, he said, holding up a pair of dark, stylish sunglasses. They make her look very mysterious. John, impatient and focused, didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Jill. Pick one, quick. Jill's patience evaporated. In her mind, a voice screamed, now what? A bigger disguise. But John's logic, to go unnoticed, was undeniable. She took a deep breath and approached the counter, looking at herself in the small mirror. She looked ridiculous, but at the same time she looked confident. She chose a pair of large, round sunglasses that hid almost half of her face. When she put them on, the world darkened and her reflection became blurry. John paid the salesperson and then looked at her. Seeing that she was now less recognizable, he felt relieved. The women's sunglasses were a perfect addition to the disguise. They resumed their journey. Jill, her voice barely audible, murmured, if Chris and Barry saw me now, they would laugh. John said nothing, but his thoughts were clear. Jill's usefulness became more apparent with every step. She knew the city, she was his guide, his personal map in this hell. It was an advantage he couldn't ignore. His mind, accustomed to solitude, felt a little more comfortable, a little more secure, knowing he wasn't alone in his quest. 2 blocks later, they arrived at a subway station, and Jill led him down some stairs that led into the underground darkness. The train arrived at the station with a metallic roar and came to a screeching halt. The doors opened, revealing an almost empty car. John and Jill quickly boarded and took seats together at the back. The train pulled away, and Raccoon City became a blurry smudge passing by the window. As John watched the scenery, he felt relieved that he didn't have to decipher the complex subway maps. The peace of mind that came with leaving that task to Jill was a luxury. He didn't have to worry about lines, connections, or possible detours. He just had to follow Jill, who seemed to move around the city as if she were walking through her own home. It was incredibly helpful, and John felt a little more comfortable with the situation. Jill sat quietly, her gaze lost in the window, in the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. She was in a kind of trance, taking in the situation. A few hours earlier, she had been in her apartment, trying to rebuild her life, but now she was on a train with a man she barely knew, heading to an unknown place to face possible danger. It was crazy. But when she looked at John, at his imposing figure and calm gaze, she felt a little reassured. John was a competent man, a man of action, and having someone like that by her side was a comfort amid the chaos. She had no idea why she was doing this, but something told her that with him, she had a chance to get out of this. She didn't question whether her decision was right, she just knew it was the best one she had at the moment. The train screeched to a halt at the subway station. Jill stood up, put away her sunglasses, and looked around. Although it was almost identical to the one they had left, the map on the wall confirmed their location. This was the right stop. "This is our stop," she said to John, her voice calm. They both got out of the car, climbed the stairs, and walked down an avenue lined with tall buildings. The streets were full of people strolling, unhurried, enjoying the day. The hustle and bustle of the city was perfect camouflage for John and Jill. "What kind of place is this?" John asked, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "It's a commercial area," Jill replied. "The school is a few blocks from here. The orphanage, the police station, everything is very close by." Jill's voice was soft, but her expression remained serious as they approached the place where city life was about to change forever. "What about the police station?" John asked, his voice low and calm. "It's close too, but I don't think we need to go there," Jill replied, her voice a whisper. "Our target is the school. If there's an umbrella base, it's most likely there." John nodded, his gaze resting on a large building a few blocks away. It was an old building with large windows and a courtyard visible in the distance, filled with children playing. "The school, it's a few minutes from here," Jill said, guessing John's thoughts. As they walked, Jill felt a little more comfortable with John's presence. Despite his silence, he was a comforting presence. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke for themselves. The way he had protected her, guided her, made her feel safe. "It's a shame all this is happening," Jill said, breaking the silence. "This town used to be such a peaceful place." John didn't respond, but nodded his head, his gaze serious. At a time like this, there wasn't much to say. Words felt empty amid the circumstances. After a few minutes, they arrived at the building. The school. At first glance, it looked like a completely normal place. Students were leaving school after classes, laughing and talking among themselves, while some of them played in the playground with other children. "Too normal," John said. Jill couldn't help but chuckle. "Too normal, what do you mean by that?" John didn't answer, but a small smile appeared on his face, something Jill hadn't seen before. They continued on their way, and after a few more minutes of walking, they were near the school entrance. Everything seemed normal. Before going in, John asked Jill what kind of school it was. "High school or middle school?" "It's a middle school," Jill replied. "There will be children and teenagers." John nodded, his expression serious. With that information in mind, he approached the entrance. A guard stopped him, asking suspiciously, "What are you looking for here?" John calmly replied, "We're both here to talk to the principal. We were called in because of our son's behavior." He was so natural that Jill blushed a little, surprised at how convincing he sounded, as if they really did have a son. The guard looked at them, then at the supposed couple, and nodded, letting them pass. Before entering, John pretended to be confused. "Could you remind us where the principal's office is? I don't remember very well." The guard, suspecting nothing, pointed him in the direction. The principal's office is near the food court, where all the kids and teens have lunch. Thanks for your help, John replied calmly. At that time of day, the hallways were empty, which gave them a little peace of mind. As they walked, Jill couldn't help but look around curiously, while John, with the direction in mind, headed for the principal's office. Do you think this is the fastest way to get information? Jill asked quietly, still looking around. It'll be the fastest, John replied. If this is really part of Umbrella, the principal must know about it. It would be a waste of time to ask teachers or other school staff. Jill nodded, recognizing the logic in his words. And how do you know he'll tell you what you're looking for? John glanced at her sideways, his expression remaining unreadable. He will, he said with complete certainty. I'm sure of it. They continued walking, the location of the principal's office firmly etched in John's mind. As they walked, John and Jill came across a girl of about 15. She looked distressed, searching desperately for something. A group of boys surrounded her, laughing and teasing her. We should intervene, Jill whispered. John looked at the situation, somewhat uncertain, and nodded. It could be a good opportunity to get some information. The girl was visibly frightened. I've lost my important things, she cried, her voice breaking. One of the boys, laughing cruelly, pulled her hair. Look at the little slut, losing her things again, one of the boys said. The girl, her eyes filled with tears, begged him to stop, please. John approached the group, his presence imposing. In a cold voice, he asked, what's going on here? The boy turned around, a mocking smile on his face that faded when he saw John. Oh, who brought you here, little slut? He sneered. Then he looked John up and down and burst out laughing. So you slept with this guy too, huh? Wow, you really are a whore. A vein bulged in John's neck, but his face remained impassive. Jill, however, frowned furiously, feeling an uncontrollable urge to punch the boy in front of her. Jill's rage was enough to freeze the boys for a moment, and then they ran away, frightened by her intense gaze. Hey, you, shouted one of the boys as he ran away, a chill in his voice. He looked at Jill with shining eyes, his hormones in overdrive, and said nervously, by the way, Mamacita, when you get tired of him, let me know, okay? I have a night you'll never forget waiting for you. Jill's fury intensified. She was about to lunge at him, but John stopped her hand with surprising calm. Jill glared at him, ready to retort, but before she could say a word, John approached the boy. The boy froze, swallowing hard. In an instant, John delivered a devastating knee to his solar plexus. The boy doubled over, falling to his knees, gasping for air, a string of drool escaping from his mouth. The other boys who were about to run stood still, petrified by what they had just witnessed. John looked at them with his icy eyes. If anyone moves, I swear I'll break your bones. One of them, the one who seemed the bravest, dared to speak, his voice trembling. My father will come after you if you dare touch me. He's an ex-military man. John interrupted him abruptly. I don't care who your father is. I assure you that I am much worse. Silence fell over the hallway. John stared at the boy who was kneeling on the floor, breathing heavily. Calmly, he grabbed him by the tips of his hair, making him scream a little, and brought him closer to his face. You little bastard, John whispered in a deep voice. If your parents didn't raise you right, I'd do it here and now, but you're in luck because I'm in a hurry. But I swear, if I see you again, it won't just be one hit. Letting the boy go, John stood up, and the others helped him to his feet. The terrified boys looked at John, who said coldly, now you can go. The girl, trembling, thanked him. I was looking for my lucky charm, she explained. She described it as a small bullet-shaped keychain. John looked at the floor and found it near a locker. He bent down, picked it up, and handed it to her. The girl sighed with relief, holding the keychain to her chest. John looked at the charm. Seeing the girl cling to a worthless object as a symbol of protection, a talisman against chaos, was a reflection of his own life. He also noticed a guitar case leaning against the locker. He ignored it for a moment, but thought the girl must be in music class. As John walked back toward Jill, the girl couldn't stop staring at the man who had just defended her. With his impeccable suit and steely gaze, he looked like something out of a movie. He looked so cool, she thought, a slight blush spreading across her cheeks. Then her eyes fell on the woman accompanying him. Jill was beautiful, and for a moment, the girl felt a pang of envy. How lucky she is, she thought. If I were a little older. The girl was lost in her thoughts for a moment. When she realized it, John and Jill were standing next to her. John, in a softer tone, asked her, "Have you seen anything strange around here? Or have you heard of any students going missing?" The girl, taken aback by the abrupt change in his voice and the nature of the question, replied honestly, "No, I haven't seen or heard anything like that." "I'm sorry." John nodded resignedly and thanked her. Just as they turned to leave, the girl called out, "Wait. My name is Melissa Miller. What's your name?" John paused for a moment, looking over his shoulder at her. "Just John," he said casually. "It was a pleasure to help you." As they walked away, Jill couldn't help but smile. "Looks like you made that girl's day," she whispered. John just laughed. "What are you imagining?" he joked. "I know that look," Jill insisted, laughing too. John shrugged and pointed to a door at the end of the hallway. "I think that's the one." They both approached with determination. John stopped in front of the door and gestured to Jill. "I'll go first. When the time is right, just go with the flow." John knocked on the office door. From the other side, a voice said, "Come in." John and Jill entered the office. The man sitting behind the desk looked like the spitting image of a school principal. His hair was neatly combed, parted in a perfect line, and his eyes, framed by thin-rimmed glasses, moved with the speed of someone who had spent years evaluating students. He wore an impeccable tweed suit with a pocket square that matched his tie, and he had a smile, albeit a tense one, on his face. An air of controlled authority emanated from him. As the door closed, John made a quick and discreet assessment of the room. His eyes scanned every corner in less than a second. He noticed the diplomas on the wall, a shelf full of football trophies, and, on a table, a stack of papers with exam notes. His gaze lingered on a photograph hanging behind the principal. In it, the principal was shaking hands with a man in a white lab coat and blonde hair. The principal stood up, his smile widening. "Come in, have a seat," he said, his voice deep and polished. "What brings you here?" "Good afternoon," said John, his voice calm and steady, stepping forward. "My name is Tacitus Kilgore, and this is my wife, Jill Kilgore." The principal nodded, his face filled with slight confusion. He leaned over a sheet of paper on his desk, searching for a name that wasn't there. "Mr. and Mrs. Kilgore, right? That's strange, we don't have you on our appointment list. Could you have the wrong school?" John remained unperturbed. "We've been thinking about moving, Principal," he replied calmly. "And we want our son, Alex, to attend a school with a good track record. But at the same time, we've been thinking that with all the news about students going missing, maybe it's not the best place." The principal's smile faded, and a vein of nervousness took hold of him. He took off his glasses and cleaned them with his pocket handkerchief. His voice became tense. "That's very strange. We always try to do what's best for our students. Could you be more specific?" "You mean the news, honey?" Jill interjected, her voice sweet and understanding, playing along with John perfectly. "Yes, honey," John replied. "I heard it on the radio. Wasn't it that some students have simply transferred to other schools?" The principal was silent for a moment, his smile fading. "No, there are no disappearances," he said coldly. "The students have simply transferred to other schools." "That's strange, don't you think? So many students transferring at once?" John asked, his voice calm and his eyes fixed on the principal. The principal stood up, his expression one of concern. "In the world of education, students come and go, don't they? It's common practice in schools for students to transfer. But I assure you, our school is one of the safest in the city." "We know," John said, his voice low and calm. "We just want our son to do well. He's had problems with other students, and we wouldn't want that to happen again." The principal, visibly nervous, began, "To show you how much we value your interest in our school, I can offer a full scholarship for your son, Alex." As he spoke, his mind returned to a phone call from 2 days ago. He remembered an exhausted male voice telling him that Brian Irons's pawn had only discovered that the man who helped Jill Valentine escape was a man in a suit. That man insisted that if he saw anyone in suspicious clothing that fit that description, or who simply seemed strange, he should contact Umbrella immediately. The director's gaze turned to John, then to Jill. He looked at Jill's clothing, a coat covering her body and glasses, and everything seemed very strange to him. He looked again at John's suit, the same one described to him in the call, and nerves took hold of him. He thought about the only way to resolve the situation without attracting attention. With a fake smile, his hand reached for the silent alert button hidden under his desk. He knew that just by touching it, Umbrella agents would come to his aid and take care of the situation. Just as his hand was about to reach the button, he felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his other hand, the one on the desk. The director let out a cry of pain. He looked at his pierced hand. A pencil, the same one that had been on the desk, was now sticking through it, and blood was gushing out uncontrollably. He doubled over, clutching his hand with his other hand. The plan to alert Umbrella was gone, and all he could think about was the pain. John, unperturbed, looked at him with his icy eyes. "Close the door, Jill," John said, his voice a cold whisper. Jill, petrified for a moment, got up from her chair and closed the door. "Now," John said, his voice a cold whisper, "we'll talk." The director, his face contorted with pain, straightened up in a rage. "Are you crazy? I'll sue you. I promise you'll regret this." John did not respond with words. Instead, he grabbed the pencil embedded in the principal's hand and twisted it slightly. The principal let out a muffled cry as more blood stained the desk. "I know what you were going to try," John said, his voice cold and monotone. "Your other hand was reaching for something under the desk, wasn't it? Maybe a gun, or a button to call for help." The principal's face paled. With a firmness that surprised Jill, John grabbed the principal by the neck with the pencil still in his hand and threw him to the floor. Jill watched the scene nervously. Clearly, she could not have done that. She did not have the skill or the cruelty to act with such speed and precision. John leaned over the principal to question him, but at that moment, a burst of gunfire echoed throughout the school. The sound was like that of a machine gun, something with a high rate of fire. John stopped, confused. He looked at the principal, who, with a bloody hand, glared at him angrily. "Did you call Umbrella?" John asked. The principal did not answer, only glaring at him with hatred. John was puzzled. If this man called for backup, it's strange that they would shoot before arriving, he thought. If it were backup, the shots would come directly at the door. It doesn't make sense. Quickly, he approached the director's desk and searched. Sure enough, he saw the silent alert button, but it didn't appear to have been pressed. His suspicions were confirmed. The attack was not from Umbrella. With controlled urgency, he approached Jill, who had already drawn her weapon. "This is strange. I don't think they're from Umbrella. Stay here and don't let the director move. I'll go investigate." Jill was about to reply, but she realized John was right. They couldn't leave the director alone, especially if he really had something to do with Umbrella. Before John opened the door, she said, "Be careful." John looked back over his shoulder, calmly. "I always do." Chapter 16. The Massacre. September 26, Raccoon City School, 2:25 p.m. The echo of the burst of gunfire reverberated through the empty hallways. John opened the door to the principal's office, his face a mask of cold determination. The sound, which had been distant and muffled before, grew louder, more immediate. It was the sound of death. "It's not reinforcements," John thought as he ran. "It sounds like a high-caliber weapon, but why?" His suspicions that this was not an Umbrella attack grew stronger with every step. He ran through the hallways, following the trail of gunpowder and blood that grew more intense. On the floor, as he advanced, he found the first signs of the massacre. A discarded textbook, stained with blood. A school backpack with a bullet hole. Turning a corner, John saw a small body lying on the floor. His heart sank, but he quickly forced himself to remain calm. He crouched down, examining the victim. It was a boy of about 12, wearing a blood-stained school uniform. He was unconscious, with a bullet in his chest. John was not a man who was easily moved. He had seen death, he had inflicted it, but this was different. This was a place of innocence, a place where children should be safe. "It's a massacre," he thought, his mind struggling to process the scene. "This isn't war, it's carnage." As he approached the cafeteria area, the sound of gunfire intensified. The dining room door was wide open, and the horror was revealed before his eyes. The place, which only minutes ago had been filled with the bustle of childhood, was now a scene of carnage. The bodies of students, both children and teenagers, were scattered across the floor. Some were still moving, writhing in pain. Others were completely still, their empty eyes staring at the ceiling. In the center of the chaos, John saw a girl. It was the same girl he had just saved, Melissa Miller. She was standing with a guitar case slung over her back and an assault rifle in her hands. She stared coldly at the bodies lying at her feet. John saw that the rifle, which was aimed at a group of students hiding under a table, was an AR-15, a military weapon. The irony of the situation was a stab in John's heart. The bullet-shaped, lucky charm she had given him back was a symbol of the death she was unleashing. "Shit," John whispered, his voice low and broken. Just as he was about to move, a small moan stopped him. John crouched down and saw a girl of about 12, her school uniform soaked in blood. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes darting around. She saw him and reached out her hand, her voice a broken whisper. "Run," she whispered, and then her hand fell, her eyes empty. John stood up. The sound of Melissa's rifle, as she unloaded a burst of bullets at the students hiding under the table, made John's blood boil. John's rage intensified, his voice hardening as he thought to himself, "That girl, she won't get away with this." John drew his weapon and prepared to end this massacre. A few minutes ago, with my guitar case on my back and the keychain John had given me back. The little lucky charm, he had saved me, he had looked at me, really looked at me, and helped me without judging. For a second, I felt safe, as if I wasn't about to fall apart. But that feeling vanished the moment I stepped into the hallway. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't from fear. It was familiar, cold, and persuasive. It was the voice. "You like him, don't you?" whispered a voice in my head. The same voice that has been with me since it all began. "Yes," I thought, "he helped me, he's the only one who doesn't look at me like I'm a joke. He's not like the others," the voice continued. "They only see what David did. What your ex-boyfriend did. They believe all the lies, don't they?" My stomach churned at the memory. I remember the whispers in the hallways, the eyes following me. The easy girl in the photos. She wanted it, otherwise why would she send them to him? David, the only guy the first ever opened my heart to, not only left me, but made sure the whole school knew about it by sharing the intimate photos I had sent him. I walked past a group of girls. They looked at me and whispered. One of them laughed, and I looked at her. Her laugh was cruel, reminding me of David's mockery. Right after that, a boy from gym class elbowed me to get past, and I felt his hand brush against my butt. "Oops," he whispered with a dirty smile as he walked away. Disgust and helplessness paralyzed me. The humiliation had scarred me. Now, every time I looked at someone, I wondered if they had seen my photos too. David had been suspended, but he had laughed in my face before he left. "No one's going to believe you, Melissa. You're a bitch, and everyone knows it." The voice that had been following me since then grew louder. "He told you the truth," the voice whispered. "And everyone who made fun of you, everyone who looked at you with contempt, believed his lies." As I entered the cafeteria, the voice in my head grew louder and more aggressive. Anger built up inside me. My mind was a tangle of voices, taunts, laughter. An echo of pain. I looked at the students and felt like they were all laughing at me, whispering, mocking me. At one of the tables, a group of students was laughing. For a moment, I felt their eyes on me. Among them, I saw David. He was sitting next to his new girlfriend, a girl from the cheerleading squad, who was laughing and pointing. David noticed my gaze and smiled at me, a smile full of malice and victory. "Are you going to play a song, Melissa? I hope it's better than your common sense," shouted a boy as he walked past me. A group of students laughed, their mockery echoing in the large dining hall. My heart sank. Music was all I had left, the only thing I could enjoy. But his comment, so simple and cruel, felt like a direct punch to the stomach. All the pain, all the anger, all the humiliation I had suffered, rushed into my chest. My mind clouded, and the world distorted. The students' faces faded away. I saw only silhouettes, dark figures with malicious smiles surrounding me. They were all the same. They weren't people. They were the faces of everyone who had laughed at me, everyone who had believed the lies, everyone who had refused to see me as a person. The whole world was against me. "Kill them," whispered the voice. "Kill them all." And without hesitation, my fingers moved on their own, my mind a helpless spectator. My hand opened my guitar case and pulled out an assault rifle. With terrifying fluidity, my body moved on its own, and I started shooting. I didn't aim at anyone in particular. I aimed at the silhouettes, at the evil that surrounded me. A burst of bullets was fired. 1, 2, 3. The echo of the shots could be heard throughout the school. The smell of gunpowder and metal filled the air. Now there was silence, only that. But that silence lasted only a moment, broken by screams and cries. The smell of blood flooded my nostrils, an overwhelming metallic stench. I heard muffled cries, pleas, regrets. And, in the distance, the sirens approaching. I looked again at the falling silhouettes. David's, his new girlfriend's, and the boy who had made fun of me. Their laughter had disappeared, replaced by cries of pain. The whole world had hurt me, and now it seemed that the world was getting what it deserved. My rifle was hot. My hand, moving on its own, led me to an overturned table where a group of girls were huddled together. One of them had once whispered to me that I was trash. Her eyes, filled with terror, were the same ones that had looked at me in the bathroom, filled with tears and fear, as I listened to the whispers and laughter outside. Now they were the ones on the floor. Now they were the ones experiencing the same terror that had overwhelmed me. Their cries were silent. It was something I had experienced. A feeling I had felt. Now I felt good. I felt very good. I listened to them, their muffled cries, their silent moans. I knew how they felt. I knew what it was like to feel the way they felt. And finally, those people who had hurt me so much were getting what they deserved. Then the dining room door burst open, and John, the man who had saved him a few minutes ago, entered. I didn't see him, or maybe I ignored him. My mind only saw the silhouettes, the taunts, the hatred. I couldn't see anyone else, not even John. I could only see the evil that surrounded me. And finally, I could hear the regret. I was about to pull the trigger to end the lives of those behind that table. But before I could hear the final cry of regret, a cold sensation flooded my left ear. I could feel something cold, and from one moment to the next, I felt my body not reacting. The voices and taunts in my mind stopped. My body, which had been moving on its own, collapsed. As I fell to the floor, my mind, in slow motion, caught a glimpse of the figure of the man who had helped me with the kids at school. He was the only one who had looked at me like a person. The only one who had seen Melissa. Now, he was holding a gun that was smoking in my direction. As I fell, I could see his face. There was no anger, no hatred. Just deep disappointment, genuine pain, something that made me regret it. I didn't want him to see me like this. But in the end, it was he himself who killed me. My lifeless body fell to the floor. My consciousness began to fade, but before it was completely gone, a small smile appeared in my mind. A smile of having accomplished my mission, and of how now, finally, I could rest from that voice that always spoke to me. The echo of the bullet reverberated through the dining room, a clean, final sound. John Wick lowered his gun, smoke still coming from the barrel. His gaze swept across the dining room, and what he saw was nothing less than hell on earth. The chaos was absolute, and the silence of the dead was the only witness to the massacre. Bodies. Too many young bodies, most of which, John assumed, had nothing to do with what had happened to the young woman. Countless lives cut short by the madness of a young woman whom he had saved from bullying just minutes ago. His eyes stopped on Melissa's body, the girl he had tried to protect. The bullet had hit her in the head. She was lying on the ground, her body collapsed in a pool of her own blood, the key ring he had given her back lying near her outstretched hand. She seemed to be smiling. John couldn't understand it, a smile of relief, of triumph, perhaps a final mockery of the world that had pushed her into the abyss. The sound of sirens, still distant but unmistakable, broke the silence. There was no time. John turned around, his footsteps echoing in the large dining room. His mind was racing against time. He returned to the principal's office, opened the door, and saw Jill, who looked at him with wide eyes, about to ask what had happened. "There's no time," he interrupted, his voice hard as steel. John pulled out his gun and, without hesitation, aimed at the director's knee. The sharp sound of the bullet mixed with the cry of pain. A cry that was a guttural roar of pain and surprise. Blood spurted from the wound, staining the office floor. "Where is Dr. William Birkin?" John asked, his face impatient and tinged with anger. His patience was as limited as the bullets in his magazine. The principal, his face pale with pain, just laughed and spat on John's shoes. The act of defiance ignited something in his gaze. Unperturbed, John aimed at the man's other knee. "You're the one in charge of this school," John said, his voice low and icy, his finger on the trigger. "I'm sure you know who comes and goes. If you tell me where he is, I might spare your life." The principal, his face covered in sweat, refused to talk. John pulled the trigger. The sound of the bullet felt like a second explosion in the small office. The principal screamed again, his pain mingling with the blood spurting from his knee. John aimed at his arms, and with the same coldness, shot each one. The pain became unbearable for the director, his face contorted with agony. "If you want to die here, that's fine with me," John continued, his voice almost a whisper. "But you'll bleed to death or get a bullet in your head. Only if you tell me the whereabouts of Dr. William Birkin will I not shoot you again, and maybe the police who arrive here will save you." Despite the unbearable pain, the director looked at him with hatred. "Go to hell." John didn't let him finish the sentence. One last shot to the head silenced the director forever. There was no time for games. The click of John's gun running out of bullets was the only sound heard after the last shot. He looked at Jill with an expression that left no room for doubt. "We have to go," he said, his voice now lower and deeper. "The police will be here any minute. Let's go out the exit." Jill nodded, her face pale but with immediate understanding. She had seen John's brutality, the efficiency with which he acted. She knew there was no room for questions or hesitation. Together, they left the office, their steps quick and controlled. The hallway was filled with an ominous silence, a silence that weighed heavily in the air. As they approached the main entrance, the sounds began to return. The murmur of frightened voices, the sobs and cries of some students who had managed to escape and were huddled outside. Jill heard fragments of whispered conversations, scattered words mixed with fear, gunshots, rifle, that girl. A chill ran down her back. The puzzle of the massacre began to take shape in her mind, piece by piece. She didn't have time to process it, as John urged her to keep going. As they left the school, they encountered organized chaos. Dozens of neighbors were approaching, drawn by the sirens that could now be heard clearly. They mingled with the terrified students at the entrance, their faces filled with shock and horror. John and Jill joined the crowd, moving as if they were part of it, their faces impassive. The people, too busy with the spectacle, didn't even notice them. With quick, determined steps, John headed east, his memory of the city working with precision. He knew exactly where to find a subway station, and Jill followed him, keeping the right distance. In the street, the flashing lights of police patrol cars grew more intense, and a chorus of sirens and ambulances dazzled in the distance. Vehicles sped past them, their drivers too focused on reaching the scene of the carnage to notice two people walking away from it. The night swallowed them up. They reached the subway entrance. The underground air was a relief, the sound of trains a welcome distraction. They descended the stairs, and a train pulled into the station. They boarded, finding a couple of empty seats in the nearly deserted car. Finally, they could stop. Jill sat across from John, her shoulders relaxed for the first time in hours, and looked at him. The doubts that had plagued her since she heard the first shots rushed through her mind. "John," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened out there?" "The gunshots." John looked at her, his expression tired but serene. With a touch of irony, as if reality were a macabre joke, he lowered his voice even further. "The girl we helped," he said, his gaze fixed on the empty space in front of him. She found a way to respond to her classmates' criticism in a, rather forceful manner. She started shooting at them all. Jill turned paler than she already was. Her mind, with a chilling click, connected the dots. John's gaze in the hallway, his haste, the students' whispers. An assault rifle. All of them, he whispered, horror in his voice. "But, why did she do that?" "I don't know," John replied, his voice almost inaudible. "All I know is that I saw her. She was about to kill a group of students, but before she could do it, I shot her in the head." The confession was so direct, so emotionless, that Jill felt her stomach clench. John looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something else in his eyes. She saw deep sadness, genuine regret, something that made her pale even more. "The world had broken her," John said, his voice a sad whisper. "But, even so, I couldn't let her do it." Jill couldn't say anything. She remained silent, processing the information. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice low and tired. "We have no information from the director. He didn't tell us anything about Umbrella or Dr. Birkin." John sighed, a sound that carried the weight of frustration. His gaze shifted from the train window to rest on Jill, a look that seemed to see past her, toward the many paths that had been closed off. "There wasn't time for a proper interrogation," he replied coldly. "I didn't expect a massacre just when I had a real chance to find a way to learn the whereabouts of that Dr. William Birkin." He sighed again, the sound more of a deflation than an exhalation. The irony of the situation was brutal. He had gained an advantage, and it had been snatched away from him in the most violent and unpredictable way possible. "It's time to slow down a bit," he said, his voice now lower, as if he were talking to himself. "With what happened at the school and the fact that I killed someone who seemed to know quite a bit about Umbrella, it will be much more difficult to attack. They must be on high alert. The authorities will be investigating every corner, and Umbrella, if they found out, will know that someone is interfering with their operation. We will be targets, and the risks are too high now." John closed his eyes, exhaustion written all over his face. His mind, however, was not resting. The image of the boy in the cafeteria, the one who had told him to run, flashed through his mind. The boy's face was full of fear, a lost innocence. John, with his life of violence and death, knew that innocence was a luxury that not many could afford, a luxury that he himself had lost long ago. He kept his eyes closed, processing everything, his mind replaying every second of the chaos, weighing his actions against the consequences. The silence lingered between them. Jill, who was also processing the horrors she had witnessed, remained silent. The heavy silence of the subway, filled with 100 stories. The sound of the train moving forward, the rattling of the wheels on the tracks, was the only noise that filled the void between them. The rest of the way to the hotel was the same. The air between them was thick, filled with mutual understanding. The train stopped at the station, and they got out, climbing the stairs back to the street. They walked in silence to the hotel entrance. The receptionist, seeing them enter, looked up. He was about to greet John as usual, with a smile and a nod, but seeing their faces, their aura of heaviness and fatigue, he decided to just nod, a subtle sign of respect and understanding. The atmosphere around them was tense, heavy, like a storm cloud hanging over them. John and Jill headed for the elevator, the tinkling of the bell breaking the silence. It stopped at Jill's floor, and she got off. John dismissed her with a simple gesture, his voice low and calm. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." Jill nodded, her gaze fixed on his face. She could tell that something had changed in him, something subtle but definite. Chapter 17. Invasion in the morning. September 27th. Raccoon City, 7 a.m. The alarm clock rang, but John was already awake. Routine, an armor built up over years of discipline, had gotten him out of bed much earlier. His body was tense, his muscles rigid, but his mind was not at ease. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see darkness, but a sea of faces. The empty eyes of the director, the bloodied faces of the children, and that of Melissa, the girl he had tried to save, who was now probably just a memory. Guilt, a feeling that rarely visited him, settled in the pit of his stomach. A subtle but persistent pain. What if he hadn't helped her? Would that tragedy have happened? He asked himself that question over and over, knowing it was a question with no answer. He couldn't count how many had died, but the stench of blood and fear still filled his senses. There were too many. After his routine, he took a shower. The hot water pounded his body, but it couldn't wash away the images of the massacre. The lifeless face of the principal, the inert bodies of the children. When he got out, he dressed in casual clothes, a black long-sleeved shirt and comfortable pants. He went to the small kitchen in his room, turned on the coffee maker, and prepared some oatmeal. The smell of coffee filled the space, a comforting familiarity. Just as he was about to take his first sip, a sound echoed through the room. A dull, dry thud, unmistakable. The sound of a gunshot. The sound was an echo, but John recognized it. It was the sound of a 9mm caliber weapon. And then, the crash of a door smashing into the wall. The kitchen knife fell from his hand, but he caught it in midair, his mind processing the information in a fraction of a second. The trap, the one he always set at his door, a thin cable stretching from his nightstand, connected to the gun he always kept handy, pointed at the door. It was a trap designed to ensure that any intruder would not get off so easily. His body, without his mind giving it the order, moved. He crouched down, the knife in his hand. He heard the muffled groan of the person who had entered and been shot. Voices in the hallway, someone's hurt. Fire. Authoritative voices, cops. He heard countless heavy footsteps, a wave of boots entering his room, radio whispers, and the sound of metal against metal. John knew what it was. It was a tactical team. SWAT or something like that. He moved silently toward the kitchen. Hidden behind an island, he pressed himself against the wall, his knife in hand. The voices were getting closer. John could hear the commanding voice. Unit 2 to the kitchen. The target may be here. The silence was broken by the sound of a foot shuffling, the sound of heavy breathing. There were 3 of them. John heard the slow, methodical footsteps approaching, and saw the tip of an assault rifle peeking around the corner. A first officer poked his head out, rifle raised. John, in his casual shirt and comfortable pants, without his usual armored suit, had no time to waste. He lunged at the man, moving in a split second, grabbed the barrel of the rifle, and pointed it at the second officer entering. The surprised officer fired. A stray bullet hit the ceiling, and the second officer took cover, his body now an unwitting shield. John didn't let him react. He used the first officer's rifle as a lever, pushed him back, and with his knife, stabbed him in the neck, in the upper chest, right in the collarbone. The man screamed, his blood splattering the wall. Without wasting a second, John pushed him toward the second officer, who was trying to shoot. The second officer, in an attempt to react, fired, but the bullet, instead of hitting John, struck the first officer, who fell to the floor, dead. John took advantage of the confusion. He lunged at the second officer, grabbed the rifle, disarmed him, and used it to block the kick coming from the third man. John, with the rifle in his hand, hit him in the face with the butt, and the man fell to the floor with a broken nose. The third man, in desperation, pulled out his gun, but John was faster. John hit him on the wrist, and the man dropped the gun. John grabbed it, and before the man could react, John shot him in the head. The other officers in the unit, who were approaching down the hallway, heard the shot and shouted, "Come in, come in. The target is in the kitchen." The fight spilled out into the hallway. The other officers, 10 men in all, entered the room. The hail of bullets shook the room. John, with the agility of a cat, moved between the shots, using the bodies of the fallen officers as shields. The fight, which had previously been a slaughter, became a struggle for survival. John moved like a specter, using every bit of the setting to his advantage. He hid behind a sofa, reloaded his gun, and lunged into the hallway, shooting the approaching officers in the head. John, gun in hand, moved quickly and stealthily. He could hear the footsteps of the rest of the men approaching, and a chill ran down his spine. He was on his turf. And John didn't like that one bit. He knew this wasn't a routine fight. These were professionals. They were here for him. The scene turned into carnage. John moved among the bodies in a ballet of death and destruction. He jumped on a fallen officer, shooting twice at the head of another who was trying to flank him. The sound of metal hitting the wall and glass breaking filled the air. An officer, hidden behind the door, shot at him. John felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as the bullet grazed him, but he didn't stop. "I got him," the officer shouted to his colleagues. John lunged at him. "Come on, you useless fools. Shoot," one of the officers in the unit shouted at his colleagues as they stood paralyzed. John lunged at the officer, hitting him in the face with his gun. The officer screamed, his face a mess of blood and flesh. John shot him in the head. The other officers, who had approached, were petrified with fear. One officer shouted at the rest of the unit, "Don't just stand there, kill him." His voice was a cry of desperation. Without hesitation, John lunged at them, using the body of the officer he had just knocked down as a makeshift shield, firing at point-blank range. The others fell to the floor, dead. One officer, desperate to flee, tried to back away, but tripped over a body. "No, please," he screamed, but was silenced by the bullet John fired into his head. Jill's point of view. Jill had been in her room, trying to fall asleep, when the gunshots woke her up. The sound was too close to ignore. The crash of John's door being knocked down made her jump out of bed. She grabbed her gun, her service Beretta, and pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. The screams, the bullets, the sound of furniture breaking. The massacre, a choreography of death that spread down the hallway. She opened her door carefully, peeking her head out. The hallway was a scene of horror. Officers' bodies lay on the floor, blood staining the walls and ceiling. The silence was heavy, broken only by the dripping of blood. Her eyes fixed on the lone figure in the center of John's room, him. John's dark shadow, motionless, watching the chaos he had created. Jill saw the last moment of the fight. She saw an officer, a man from the tactical unit, who had stumbled over a body. He knelt down, pleading. "No, please," he cried, his voice shaking. She saw John raise his gun and shoot him in the head without hesitation. Jill closed her eyes for a second, her mind struggling to process what she had seen. The blood of her enemies in the streets, their fear, the stench of death. It all felt too real. But she couldn't remain paralyzed. When she opened her eyes, she saw the flash of a gun. It was an officer, who had been hiding behind the sofa, and was now pointing at John's back. Time stood still. Jill didn't think about anything, her mind acted on its own, her body reacted instinctively. She raised her gun, and without thinking twice, fired. The sound of her shot echoed through the hallway. The officer, who was about to shoot, fell to the floor, Jill's bullet piercing his head, right in the center of his forehead. Silence reigned once more, a silence broken only by John's heavy breathing and the trickle of blood flowing from his shoulder. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and death, felt heavy. Jill moved slowly closer, her gaze fixed on the dark stain spreading across John's shoulder. The fabric was soaked, and a trickle of fresh blood ran down his arm, dripping onto the floor. "John, you're hurt," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jill reached out a trembling hand, wanting to touch the wound. John, without looking at her, stopped her hand with his own, a gentle but firm interruption. His skin was cold, his grip, despite his injury, unyielding. "There's no time for that," John hissed, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We have to go, now." His gaze darted around, assessing the room, the bodies, the possible exits. "But your shoulder is bleeding," Jill exclaimed, her voice breaking with desperation. "It's a gunshot wound. It could get infected. Let me help you, please. I'm an expert in combat medicine, I can stop the bleeding." John interrupted her, his gaze finally meeting hers. It was a hard, pragmatic look, without a trace of emotion. "This isn't the time," he repeated firmly, his voice low and icy. "You need to pack the most urgent things and get out of here." Jill nodded reluctantly, turning to go to her room. But John stopped her again, his voice even lower. "I'm the one who's leaving," he said. Jill turned, confused, her heart pounding. "What?" "Think about it, Jill," John explained, his voice devoid of emotion. "The police aren't looking for you. They probably don't even know you were here. If I stay with you, you'll put yourself at risk. It would be easier for me to escape alone. There's no reason for you to expose yourself to those who are after me. They're looking for me, not you." "I want to go with you," Jill replied, her voice breaking with emotion. "After what just happened, I can't stay here. I don't want you to go alone. You can't expect me to leave you here, hurt, alone." John shook his head, unmoved, and looked her in the eyes. "My life is a problem, Jill. It's a complication that isn't yours. Escaping alone is much easier." Jill looked at him helplessly, the weight of his words sinking into her, each one a slab of resignation. She nodded, the discouragement evident in her eyes, knowing that his logic was unbreakable and the coldness in his voice was the greatest sign of the reality John was living. John looked at her for a moment, and then a slight smile appeared on his lips, the first sign of warmth he had shown all morning. "Although," he said in a playful tone that contrasted with the seriousness of his face, "I could use an extra pair of hands to pack, since I have one shoulder out of commission." Jill sighed, a mixture of resignation and relief. For a second, the weight of the world felt lighter. "Please," she said. John nodded toward a corner of the kitchen. "I have all the essentials in a backpack. Grab it, I'll get changed." Jill nodded, and while John headed for the bathroom, she went to look for the backpack he had pointed out under the sink. A new chapter was about to begin for both of them. 2 minutes after the massacre, the silence in the hallway felt even thicker than before. Jill's breathing, agitated and shallow, echoed in her ears. She had rushed to her room, the weight of John's backpack on her shoulder, waiting for him to come out of the bathroom. The squeak of the faucet as it opened and closed, the sound of footsteps as he changed clothes, every little noise reminded her that she was not alone in this hell. John came out of the bathroom wearing a new set of clothes. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes were cold and calculating. The wound on his shoulder looked a little darker, a patch of blood had stained his new shirt, but he didn't seem to care. Jill, with the backpack firmly on her shoulder, looked at him, waiting for him to say something. John approached her with slow, deliberate steps, his gaze scanning the corners of Jill's room, looking for possible threats. He stopped a few feet away from her. "Jill," he said in a low, controlled voice. "Don't leave right away, wait a few hours." Jill frowned, confused. "Why? I thought you were going to leave first to create a distraction." John nodded, his eyes fixed on the hallway door. "That's right, the hotel is probably surrounded by agents, either police or professionals. I'll leave to divert their attention. You take advantage of the moment when the chaos calms down and the hotel is out of sight of the police to escape. When I manage to escape, I'll give you the signal." Jill nodded, her voice full of discouragement, even though the plan made sense. I understand, but is your shoulder okay? Won't it get in the way? John shrugged, the wound on his shoulder a constant reminder of his vulnerability. Don't worry about that, I've had worse injuries, I'll take care of them. The priority is for you to get out of here alive. When I leave and the chaos subsides, leave the hotel through the emergency exit. I'll be in touch with you by phone. Just as John was about to say something else, a new sound echoed in the hallway. Footsteps, heavy, methodical, countless. The sound of combat boots was approaching their door. John and Jill looked at each other, their eyes reflecting the same alarm. John's smile faded, his face returning to the mask of coldness he always wore. Get behind cover, John hissed, his voice low and urgent. And get ready to fight. They're here. Jill lunged for the door, grabbing her beretta, but stopped. Wait, John, if they're not the police, if they're professionals, can't we just... No, John interrupted her in a tone that brooked no argument. They don't know you, I'm their target, if they find out you're with me, you'll be collateral damage. I don't have time to deal with that, nor do I want you to become a target. The only way they won't know you're with me is to kill everyone who comes near. Jill looked at him, her mind in turmoil. Kill again, the scene of the massacre in the hallway was still fresh in her mind. She closed her eyes for a second, the conflict inside her palpable. The massacre of the officers, begging for their lives. She didn't want to do it again. But seeing the urgency in John's eyes, the tense situation, there was no choice. John's voice, though cold, had a trace of concern. Jill, knowing there was no time to think, nodded firmly, the indecision fading from her eyes. I'm ready, she said. John, who had positioned himself behind the corner of the room, smiled. It was a cold smile, without joy, but it was a smile of relief. Good, he said. Jill moved to the other corner of the room, her beretta in hand, her mind focused on the hallway. The sound of footsteps grew louder, clearer. John looked at her, his gaze suddenly softening, just for an instant. Together, he hissed. Jill nodded, her heart pounding. They both braced for the attack. A dark shadow appeared around the corner of the hallway. It wasn't the SWAT team's assault rifle, but the tip of an MP5. Then another, and another, until 6 men, dressed in black combat uniforms and gas masks with red lenses over their eyes, appeared. They were very different from the police officers she had faced before, with a more lethal appearance and no visible insignia. John noticed the difference, but didn't seem to care much. His expression grew even colder. John prepared himself. Unlike the first encounter, he was now wearing his armored suit. He carried his pistol with plenty of ammunition on his belt and the rest of his equipment. Despite the persistent pain in his shoulder, the man moved with deadly fluidity. The moment the first MP5 peeked out a little further, John sprang into action. The room exploded into chaos with gunfire and movement. John, grimacing in pain, spun around to shoot the first assailant in the leg. But the man, with surprising agility, slid sideways. John had to adjust his aim in a split second, the strain on his injured shoulder causing him to miss the first shot. He recovered instantly and the second shot hit the man in the knee, who fell with a cry. Meanwhile, Jill, from her position, shot him with her beretta, a precise and accurate shot to the head, ensuring that the enemy could not recover. John didn't stop, shooting the next man in the knee. This man, however, ducked and took cover, deflecting the bullet with the MP5 he was holding. John moved, using the first man's body as a shield to cover himself from the other shots. Then, with astonishing speed, he ducked down, picked up the fallen MP5, and shot one of the assailants in the chest. His opponent's shots did nothing to him, thanks to his armored suit. John threw away the empty weapon and lunged at the next one. The attacker didn't stand still. He blocked John's arm with his forearm, a hard blow that sent a sharp pain through John's injured shoulder. At that moment, Jill saw the other attacker moving to flank John. She shouted, "Right," and in a sudden maneuver, shot him in the shoulder, causing him to fall. The pain made the assailant scream, and John took advantage of the distraction to immobilize the man in front of him. John used the assailant's weapon to break his neck. The killer in the black suit growled, pushing harder to bend his opponent's arm. The attacker attempted a counterattack with a kick to the chest, but John dodged it. John faced the 2 remaining attackers. One of them attempted a high kick. John ducked to avoid it, but the sudden movement caused a wave of pain in his shoulder. Instead of a clean hit, his punch to the man's stomach was more of a shove, which didn't knock him down completely. The attacker staggered back, his partner seizing the moment of vulnerability to launch an attack at his head. John leaned to the side, feeling the air from the barrel as it passed, and shot the man in the chest before he had time to react. Jill, seeing the danger, didn't stop, and in a rush of adrenaline, continued to shoot at the falling man as she moved. John realized that the last attacker was preparing to shoot, but John shot him in the knees. The man fell, and John crouched down, gun in hand, and looked at him. The man, his gas mask eyes glowing bright red, stared at him with fury. John, without hesitation, shot him in the stomach and chest. Silence returned, as suddenly as it had been interrupted. The hallway was littered with corpses. The smell of gunpowder and fresh blood was overwhelming. With his weapon still smoking, John moved among the bodies. The assailants writhing on the floor, trying to crawl away or simply moaning in pain, were quickly silenced with a precise shot to the head. There was no mercy, no hesitation. His face, visibly exhausted and his forehead covered in sweat, showed no emotion. It was a job that had to be finished. Jill watched the scene, a chill running down her spine. She had seen John's brutality before, but witnessing him so calm and lethal after such an intense fight reminded her that the myth of Baba Yaga was much more than just a story. They looked at each other, adrenaline still pumping through their veins. They had fought as one, their movements coordinated like a deadly dance, but this time, John was visibly exhausted, while Jill, despite the tension, looked confident. "I have to go now," John said hoarsely, each word seeming like an effort. "Stay here. Don't leave the room until everything has calmed down. It's probably not safe to even move down the hallway." Jill nodded, concern reflected in her eyes. "Take care of your wound," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And stay alive." John didn't respond with words, only a slight nod, a gesture that showed a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He turned, slung his backpack over his shoulders, and began walking down the hallway. Jill watched him as the brutal scene unfolded. The bodies of the SWAT team mingled with those of the new attackers, creating a macabre vision of the massacre. John, his suit stained, walked through the center of the carnage, his cold gaze already calculating his next move. The elevator was not an option. It was a bottleneck, a perfect place for an ambush. John, pistol in hand, decided that the only way out was the staircase. It might be a longer route, but at least it would give him more options if they found him. As his thoughts swirled, he decided to use one of the grenades in his backpack to clear the main entrance. Suddenly, the footsteps became more audible. A rhythmic, disciplined sound, rising from the lower floors. John didn't need to see them to know they weren't disorganized enemies. They were professionals, probably reinforcements from the Raccoon City Police Department. He crouched down, hiding behind a wall as he peeked out to sea. He saw a squad, at least 6 men, climbing the stairs in perfect wedge formation. He heard a murmur among them. "The hotel is sealed. The target is inside," whispered one. "Understood. We'll search for him, but don't let your guard down," replied the team leader in a deep voice. John knew there was no other option. The narrow stairwell left them with no blind spots. He took one of the 2 grenades from his backpack. Despite the pain, his mind was cold and focused. 3, 2, 1. His internal count had no trace of panic, it was simply the sequence of a businessman. He pulled the pin from the grenade and threw it with deadly precision. The grenade flew in a perfect arc, landing directly in the center of the formation. "Grenade!" shouted one of the agents, his voice breaking with panic. "No, wait!" shouted another as he lunged toward the grenade, trying futilely to pick it up and throw it away. He didn't have time, and his effort was in vain. The roar of the explosion shook the building. The air filled with the screech of shrapnel and an echo of twisted metal. The force of the explosion threw the remains of bodies down the steps. Metal and blood stained the walls, while our human remains fell to the floor below, creating a brutal and gruesome scene. John didn't even blink. With the gun still in his hand, he ignored the massacre he had just created. He continued down the stairs, his feet treading carefully so as not to slip on the blood and body parts. His emotionless face focused on the next obstacle, the fence that awaited him at the main entrance. John continued his descent down the stairs, step by step, his mind a map of possible escape routes and points of attack. Each step creaked under his feet, a sound that was music to his ears amid the silence he had left behind. The remains of the slaughtered agents were still scattered across the steps. The smell of gunpowder and blood was strong, but John paid no attention to it. His only obsession was to get out of the hotel. When he reached the top floor, total silence enveloped the place. John looked around. The hotel lobby was deserted. The furniture and decorations were intact, but there was no sign of the receptionists or bellboys. The morning sun filtered through the large windows at the entrance, illuminating the dust floating in the air. The golden glow of the morning created a stark contrast to the cold darkness John carried with him. Through the large windows at the entrance, John could see the street. His cold, emotionless gaze swept across the scene. In the light of day, the sight was even more shocking. Raccoon City police vehicles and special forces armored trucks were parked in a near-perfect circle. The sun glinted off the metal and glass of the vehicles, creating flashes that bounced off John's face. He was completely surrounded. Change of perspective. Inside a communications booth in a SWAT van, the leader of the operation, SWAT Lieutenant Marcus Vance, slammed his fist on the table. His face, illuminated by the harsh sunlight streaming through the window, was contorted with rage and disbelief. "What the hell is going on in there?" he yelled at an officer. "I sent 2 of my best teams in to capture 1 man, and now there's no communication." "Nothing. The radios are dead." "We don't know, Lieutenant," the officer replied in a shaky voice. "They just stopped responding." "It's just 1 man. 1 damn man," Marcus roared, his frustration boiling over. "How is it possible for an entire professional squad to disappear without a trace? Something is wrong here." At that moment, another officer's voice rang out. "Lieutenant Vance, I have movement at the hotel entrance." Marcus and the officer next to him froze. The lieutenant frowned. He jumped up, got out of the van, and looked toward the large windows at the hotel entrance. He could see his reflection in the glass, and behind him, that of his team, all with the same look of disbelief. The sunlight bathed them, revealing their tension. Then he saw him, a lone figure emerging from the shadows of the lobby. It was the target, the man they had come to capture, dead or alive. John Wick. The lieutenant felt a chill run down his spine. Wick's suit was stained with blood, but his posture was as relentless as that of a predator. John's cold stare made him feel like prey. Before Marcus could shout an order, or even pull the trigger, John raised a hand and fired his gun directly at the glass separating them. The glass shattered into thousands of pieces, scattering across the floor with a sound of breaking glass. John's hand didn't stop, and in one swift motion, he threw an object. Lieutenant Vance, in the heat of the moment, could immediately see the object John had thrown. It was a grenade. The grenade flew in a perfect arc, glistening in the morning sunlight, and landed where the concentration of police cars was densest. 2 seconds later, a series of chain explosions echoed throughout the area. Countless police officers who were unable to escape in time were caught in the explosion, while the chain reaction of the cars caused everyone to lose sight of John for a moment. Lieutenant Marcus Vance was thrown into the air by the shockwave from a car near his own. The roar of the explosions turned into a dull echo. The shockwave had knocked John down, but he got up immediately, with the agility of a cat. Thick, toxic black smoke spread across the street, devouring the sunlight. It was the perfect cover. The opportunity he had been waiting for. As police sirens and the cries of wounded officers mingled with the roar of cars still exploding, John ran. His suit, now more than ever, blended in with the darkness of the smoke. He zigzagged between the burning vehicles, dodging the few police officers who were still standing, dazed. He could hear their cries, their voices broken by panic and pain. "He's getting away. Fire! Fire at the target! Where the hell is that bastard?" Adrenaline pumped through John's veins. He moved with deadly speed, making several sharp turns to lose his pursuers. He ducked into a narrow alley, cutting through the network of passageways he knew so well. The voices faded behind him, replaced by the distant clamor of the main street. With each step he took, his movements became more fluid, more precise. That's when he saw it. A yellow taxi, parked on the corner. The engine was running, and the driver seemed to be waiting for a passenger. Without hesitation, John opened the back door and slid inside. The driver, a middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap, was startled to feel someone get into his car. He looked in the rearview mirror and his eyes widened. He saw a man in an expensive suit, but stained with blood and dirt. His face was covered in soot and a deep scar crossed his forehead. John's gaze was cold and empty, that of a predator who had just finished his hunt. The taxi driver blinked, and a light of recognition came on in his face. His lower lip began to tremble. "Why you?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. You're the one who caused the massacre at the school. The driver leaned over to open the door and escape, but an icy sensation ran down the back of his neck. The barrel of John Wick's gun had settled on the back of his head. Don't you dare get out of this taxi. John's voice was a low, dangerous growl. Or I'll kill you right here. The man stood still, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. John moved the gun slightly away, but kept it pointed. Why are you saying I was the one who caused the massacre? John demanded, his voice emotionless. The driver swallowed hard. Today on the news, they released a video from the school cafeteria. In the video, you can see you shooting a student, while everyone else in the cafeteria is dead. They say that you are responsible for everything. John processed the information in an instant. The cafeteria had a camera. It was the only logical conclusion. The police, working for Umbrella, hadn't wasted any time. They had manipulated the evidence, edited the video to frame him and use him as a scapegoat. It was a cynical and brilliant plan. John clenched his jaw. They were framing him. Take me to the nearest abandoned place, John ordered. His voice left no room for doubt. The taxi driver, with the gun still pointed at him, just nodded fearfully, started the car, and drove away from the chaos, into the city of Raccoon City. Chapter 18. Consequences. September 27th. Raccoon City. 9 a.m. The taxi stopped in front of a mass of concrete and brick, a skeleton of what was once a factory. Its windows were broken, like empty eye sockets, and the decayed concrete was mixed with the faded colors of graffiti and the grime of decades of abandonment. The air smelled of mold and rust, a pungent aroma that clung to the throat. From the back seat, John observed the scene, his gaze sweeping over every shadow, every potential hiding spot. His eyes didn't see a building, they saw a map of dangers and opportunities. The taxi driver, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, barely dared to breathe. Sir, this is it, he stammered, his voice a thread of fear. John didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze locked onto the man's eyes through the rearview mirror. On the driver's face, which was still pale from the news he had heard on the radio about the massacre at the school, a mixture of terror and an almost palpable suspicion was reflected. It was the look of someone who had associated John's face with that of the monster he had seen on the news. It was the fear of knowing that, at that moment, he was in the same car with the alleged perpetrator of such a heinous act. Get out, John ordered. His voice was a hoarse whisper that cut through the tense silence. The taxi driver tensed, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a death-like force. No. Please, he begged, tears in his eyes. Desperation drove him to attempt an escape, and his hand moved toward the doorknob. But before he could open the door, the cold, hard barrel of a pistol was placed on the back of his neck, just below his ear. Don't you dare get out of this taxi, John's voice was a low, dangerous growl. Or I'll kill you right here. The man froze, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. John slightly moved the weapon away, but kept it aimed. Get out, go straight to the entrance and go in. Don't turn around, I'll stay in the car and watch you. The man obeyed, his movements slow and shaky, as if he were about to break. He staggered toward the building's entrance, a thread of drool falling from the corner of his lips. From the back seat, John watched him, his hawk-like gaze fixed on his every step. When the taxi driver disappeared into the dark mouth of the building, John took a moment to scan the surroundings. There was no one. The silence was almost total, only interrupted by the creaking of a door opening and closing in the wind. After confirming that no one else was around, John got out of the taxi and headed for the entrance. The interior was a nightmare of decay. The morning light barely penetrated the broken windows, creating a ghostly atmosphere. The cold, dense air had a sour, metallic smell. The taxi driver was waiting, trembling, in the lobby, his eyes fixed on the floor. Go up to the next floor, John ordered. The taxi driver, not daring to look at him, went up the stairs. His feet dragged through the dirt and dust accumulated on the floor, leaving a trail of footprints in his wake. Please, sir, I beg you, don't kill me, the man stammered, his eyes on the floor. I won't say anything to the police. I swear, and I won't tell them anything about the school. John ignored the pleas. His eyes, instead, constantly moved, analyzing the building. The graffiti was more noticeable here. He could see signs for "Danger Zone," "Do Not Enter," and on one of the walls, a painting of a person with a hat, with a smile that covered their entire face. The place wasn't just an abandoned building, it was a mausoleum. A tomb for hope and innocence. John saw some mattresses in the corner, some blankets, a bowl of food full of mold. The place had been inhabited, but for the moment it was empty. As they went up to the second floor, John smelled a strong odor of urine and blood, a smell that made his body tense up. With every step, John struggled with himself. The debate that had started in his mind in the taxi continued. A simple taxi, an innocent man, a witness. Was it worth killing someone who hadn't done anything, who wasn't part of this world of violence and death? But, if he didn't, the man could warn the police. The outside world already believed he was a child killer. His own survival depended on his decision. Was he a cold-blooded killer, or a man fighting to survive? It was a question he had never had to ask. His entire life had been a straight line, a path that did not admit morality. But this world was different. They reached the second floor. The taxi driver, now speechless, knelt, his hands trembling. Tears streamed down his cheeks. "No, please," he begged. "I have a family, my children. Please." John, with an almost imperceptible expression of pain on his face, took out his pistol. The taxi driver looked at John with a mixture of terror and despair. John, with a trembling hand, took the silencer out of his backpack, slowly screwed it onto the barrel of the pistol, the sound of the thread echoing in the silence. The taxi driver completely broke down. His sobs were uncontrollable. John pointed the gun down at him, with the look of a man who had lost faith. "Even if you think I'm the one who caused the massacre," John's voice was a whisper, "wouldn't you warn the police about the possible culprit of a school massacre just because I let you live? Will you live with the conscience of not helping the police find someone who possibly did a lot of harm? If you meet a parent who lost their child, won't you tell them where I am?" The taxi driver couldn't respond. John's words had disarmed his resistance, his last bastion. His sobs were muffled, but there was no response. Just a look of hatred. John, with the pistol pointed forward, his gaze empty, said to him, "If I were you, I would definitely tell the police that there's a damn psychopath hiding in a building. It's what any decent person would do." The taxi driver, who had stopped sobbing, looked at him with rage. "You damned bastard, you're a..." The sound of the silencer was a soft plop, and the taxi driver collapsed before his insult could be completed. The bullet had impacted his forehead, right between the eyes. The body fell to the ground, the taxi driver's head broke open like an egg. John didn't flinch. His gaze, cold and emotionless, showed no regret, just a slight trace of sadness that was lost in the fog of morality. John looked at the inert body. There was no doubt that he had done the right thing. Logic had won over morality. With an almost imperceptible sigh, he went up one more floor. The staircase, full of debris and dust, was a path that was lost in the semi-darkness. Upon reaching the third floor, the view changed drastically. The windows, although dirty and broken, offered a wider panorama of the city. Raccoon City stretched out before him like a city under siege. The streets, although not deserted, lacked the usual activity. The businesses were closed, the shutters down, as if the entire city had shrunk in fear. Some abandoned cars lay on the side of the street, a subtle sign of the panic that had broken out. The view, despite its desolation, offered him a sense of control that had escaped him during the last few hours. From above, John observed the city's panorama. It looked like a city in mourning, a giant wounded by a tragedy it couldn't fully understand. He reflected on the taxi driver's words, the massacre at the school, and the video that incriminated him. A chill ran down his spine. If the taxi driver was right, his face, that of a man masked by guilt, must be on every news channel, in every newspaper in the city. His image, that of the man who had massacred innocents, had been etched into the collective mind of Raccoon City. He had been framed, turned into the villain of a story that wasn't his. For the first time in hours, John felt the vulnerability of his situation. His face was now a red flag, a magnet for unwanted attention. Therefore, going out into the street was not an option at this time. He entered a room, whose door frame had been torn off, leaving a dark and desolate hole. The place, like the rest of the building, was a testament to decay. The floor was covered with dust and shards of broken glass, the paint peeling in strips from the walls, revealing layers of different colors. In one corner, a pile of old newspapers and dirty blankets served as a reminder that others had sought refuge there before him. John felt the atmosphere, the calm of desolation. This place, for a moment, was a sanctuary. With a serenity that contrasted with the brutality of his recent actions, John took off his jacket and then his shirt. The cold air of the room caressed his skin, and a sharp pain in his left shoulder reminded him of the wound he had ignored. A trail of dried blood extended from his collarbone to his shoulder, a dark and sticky stain on his skin. He approached the broken window, and carefully, he picked up a piece of glass. He used it as a makeshift mirror, getting closer to the wound to examine it with precision. In the dim light, he could see that the bullet had only grazed the skin, leaving a deep but superficial cut. The relief he felt was immense. There wasn't a bullet embedded in his body, which would have been a much bigger problem. With the urgency of a surgeon, he took a small bottle of alcohol and a bandage from his backpack. The bottle of alcohol, with a strong and penetrating aroma, seemed almost intimidating. John poured a stream of the liquid over the wound, the burning making him clench his teeth. The skin around the wound turned red, the alcohol disinfecting the area with a silent fury. The sensation was a mixture of pain and purification. Once the burning dissipated, John carefully wrapped the wound, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. The bandage, an immaculate white, was a surprising contrast to the gray and dirty surroundings. Once the bandage was in place, John let himself fall to the floor, leaning against the cold, damp wall. His gaze was lost in the dark hole that had once been a door, his eyes fixed on nothingness. The adrenaline, that force that had propelled him through violence, persecution, and moral dilemma, began to dissipate. The muscles in his body relaxed, the tension he had maintained for hours vanished. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply rest. The silence of the room was his only refuge, the only place in Raccoon City where he didn't have to run, where he didn't have to fight. It was a moment of calm before the next storm. Several hours later, September 27th, Spencer Mansion, France, 1:15 p.m. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, bathing the library in a golden glow. The light highlighted the hand-carved wooden moldings, the shelves that housed ancient leather-bound volumes, and the intricate patterns of the Persian rug that covered the floor. The mansion, a fortress of elegance and opulence, seemed an echo of its owner's personality, imposing, immaculate, and distant. Seated on a crimson velvet chaise longue, Oswell E. Spencer, the mastermind behind Umbrella, contemplated the landscape. The panoramic window offered a breathtaking view of the vine-covered valley and the vast forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. The silence of the place was almost tangible, broken only by the soft whisper of the breeze. Despite the tranquility of his surroundings, Spencer's expression was one of unwavering boredom, as if the luxury around him were a habit rather than a pleasure. He held a phone between his long, thin fingers, his other hand resting on the head of one of the bronze eagles that adorned the arm of the chair. The voice on the other end of the line was that of an Umbrella executive, his tone anxious and formal as he provided a detailed report. "Mr. Spencer," the voice faltered. "The events in Raccoon City have escalated. The security team at the school lost contact. The director has been neutralized. A single shot to the head. Reports indicate it was a methodical and precise assassination." Spencer nodded slowly, without taking his eyes off the landscape. "An inconvenience, to be sure. It's a shame. He was a man with great potential, despite his tendencies." He paused, as if weighing something. "You say you have an image of the one who caused the pharmacy fire and the incident at the school?" "Yes, sir. He was captured by one of our security cameras. Analysts believe he is the same person who has been causing problems since his arrival in the city." "He's not dead yet," Spencer stated, with a touch of resignation. There was an uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line. The executive cleared his throat. "Sir, to stop this individual, we sent several teams of Raccoon City Police Special Forces, as well as a small Umbrella elimination team. But they were all eliminated. The crime scene was, to use the forensic expert's words, a complete mess. Only one of our agents survived, and he could barely speak." A sarcastic smile formed on Spencer's lips. He turned to the window, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Let me see if I understood correctly. A single man, one man, you say, was able to eliminate several teams of trained police officers in the Umbrella elimination group." The executive's voice became a stammer, full of shame. "Yes, sir, that's right." Spencer was about to hang up, a gesture of annoyance that was characteristic of him. But the voice on the other end of the call desperately sped up. "Sir, wait, our forensic police also found traces of this man's blood. The Nemesis project is underway, and a Nemesis could target him if we add this new genetic trace." Should we do it, sir? Spencer stopped, his finger suspended over the hang-up button. He took his time to consider it, as if the fate of humanity were a triviality. Do it, he finally replied, with a tone of annoyance. And without waiting any longer, he hung up. He picked up a crystal glass from the side table, filled it with a blood-red wine, and took a sip. As he looked at the landscape, the reflection of the sun in his glass, a notification flashed on his small laptop. It was an image, the photo of John Wick's face, captured by a camera in Raccoon City. Spencer looked at it closely. The face seemed familiar. The story of his subordinate, the audacity of a single man who had outwitted an entire organization. The weight of familiarity grew, and a flash of anger crossed his eyes. He rose from the chair, glass in hand, and approached the window, his gaze fixed on John's image. John Wick, he whispered with contained fury. So you're alive. It seems that the stupid assassin's organization wants to start a war with Umbrella. We'll have him in our sights. Soon you'll be dead. He drank the rest of his wine in one gulp, the dark liquid as bitter as his anger. The photograph on his laptop screen seemed to look back at him, a silent challenge that enraged him even more. Ignoring the photo of John Wick still flashing on his laptop screen, he took a phone from his inner pocket. It was an obsolete model, without a touchscreen or smart functions, but with a security that was worth its weight in gold. He dialed a sequence of numbers that only a dozen people in the world knew. The line connected in a prolonged silence, a tension that only those at the pinnacle of power can understand. Serious, Spencer said, using a code name he rarely spoke. The voice on the other end was deep and polite, but with a coldness that mirrored Spencer's. Lord Spencer, the voice replied, with an impeccable British accent. I wasn't expecting your call. I hope the reason is of great importance. You can bet it is, Spencer replied, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. It seems there's a problem with one of your properties. Or to be more precise, with your failure to contain it. Sirius's voice instantly tensed. I don't know what you're talking about. All our properties are under control and internal matters are our concern. Oh, of course you do, Spencer continued, his voice turning into a threatening purr. Your best asset, your Baba Yaga, the man your pathetic organization supposedly eliminated, has been attacking several of my headquarters in Raccoon City. How is it that a man who was promised eternal rest is walking around one of my cities, causing havoc, destroying property, and eliminating my best men? Am I missing something? Is this a declaration? Is the High Table trying to send a message of force to Umbrella? Sirius's voice turned icy, his politeness a mask for his anger. Oswell, that is a bold accusation and one I will not tolerate. John Wick is not an asset, he is an enemy of our organization. He is supposed to be dead, his existence is an affront to everything we represent. What happens in your cities is your problem, not ours. It's a matter of your internal security. Spencer laughed, a dry, bitter sound that resonated in the room. Your problem, you say. A man, alone, eliminated my security teams, mocked the special forces, and is now threatening me with his very existence. And you tell me it's not a direct message? Are you running out of assassins, Sirius? Are you so desperate that you had to resort to your urban legends to provoke me? I assure you that this ghost is very real and very lethal. And if you don't believe it, maybe you need a reminder. A small reminder of my wrath. Perhaps one of my divisions will get lost and end up taking down the Continental hotels. Perhaps an accident at one of their places of worship. Do you understand my point, Sirius? Your ignorance of our rules is blinding you, Oswell. John Wick is excommunicado, he is outside our protection and is a pariah. There is no help from the Continentals, there is nothing. He is one man against the world. Don't threaten to involve us. You know what happens when you touch the Continental hotels. Spencer interrupted him with another laugh, his tone full of contempt. Rules. What beautiful, ridiculous rules you have. I can't help but find it fascinating how you adhere to those foolish codes while the world is falling apart. Do you really think that I, the mind behind the T-Virus and Nemesis, care about the rules of a hotel? Do you think a simple motto like, no business on Continental ground, will deter me? Don't you threaten me, Sirius. Because unlike your rules, my threats are real. Sirius's voice hardened, the politeness completely abandoned. Don't you dare cross that line, Oswell. We will not tolerate you touching a single one of our branches. This is a warning, or you unleash a war that not even you, with all your monsters, can win. Spencer leaned forward, his voice an eerie calm, like that of a predator before it strikes. "Oh, you're threatening me. How brave." His smile was a quick, lethal flash. "I'll give you a piece of advice, Sirius, my best man, the nemesis, is on his way. He feeds on blood, and he just got some of your precious assassins. Consider this the first and only warning. If your organization interferes, you will discover that my threats are not words. They are facts." Spencer hung up before Sirius could respond. He stood in front of the window, contemplating the landscape. The peace of the valley now seemed a thin veil over the storm he had just unleashed. He picked up the small laptop and looked at John's photo. "Let's see if your rules save you from this, Wick," he whispered with a cold smile. Chapter 19. The High Table and the Judgment. High Table Headquarters, New York. 1:20 p.m. The phone in Sirius's hand felt like a cold stone. Spencer's call had ended abruptly, leaving an icy void in the lavish meeting room, a place where power was measured in whispers and glances, not direct threats. Sirius, a man of immense composure, felt a tick in his jaw. There was a contained fury in his eyes that was rarely seen. He placed the phone on the mahogany table, the sound of its contact with the wood breaking the silence like a gunshot. Facing him, 4 other members of the High Table watched. They were the organization's highest and most enigmatic figures, their faces impassive. There was a man with silver hair and a cunning gaze, his name was Victor. An ageless-looking woman, named Lilani. Another man in his 30s but with the gaze of a sage, named Kalen. And a robust man with a thick voice, named Darian. They had been listening to the call in silence. Their silence was the harshest judgment that could be given. "A man against the world." Darian spoke, and although it was a question, the mockery in his tone was palpable. "It seems that man is about to unleash a war, Sirius." "One man can't do that," Sirius replied firmly, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "It's Spencer's arrogance. He thinks he can use John Wick as a pretext. John is a ghost." "Then ghosts leave blood trails," Lilani interrupted, her voice a glacial whisper. She pulled an iPad from her portfolio, and with a quick gesture, projected an image onto the main screen. It was a news headline, with a photo that was being repeated on every news channel in the United States. A headline that read, "The Raccoon City shooter, a cold-blooded killer or a victim of conspiracy." But it was the image that stole all the attention. A fragment of a video, grainy and blurry, captured by the school cafeteria's camera. John Wick was visible, in his suit, aiming his pistol. And in front of him, a girl in her school uniform. The image was frozen just at the moment the girl was seen falling. The video was cut there. It showed nothing more than that scene. It only showed John Wick, the alleged murderer of the girl. The headline was a rhetorical question, but the photo was a sentence. People, by nature, need nothing more than a fragment to judge. And the judgment had already been made. The room fell silent. All the members of the High Table understood the message. "A video for collective hatred," Victor said. "A video that will corner him, a video so he can't hide. Spencer is burning all the bridges that are left." Sirius nodded, his face grim. "He's using people's ignorance and rage as a weapon. He's turning him into a pariah, even in a world that knows nothing of our rules. It's a bold move, and a dirty one. Spencer is underestimating the loyalty of our members." "Loyalty?" Darian laughed. "Spencer isn't underestimating our loyalty. He's exposing our vulnerability. He's using one of our own to drag us into the public light." Sirius looked at him with fury. At that moment, the doors of the room opened and a familiar figure entered. It was the adjudicator, the same woman who had overseen the elimination of John Wick in New York. She wore her white suit and her face was expressionless, but there was a slight tension in her shoulders. She knelt, her head bowed. Sirius looked at her with fury. "John Wick was supposed to die, adjudicator. Where is his body?" The adjudicator looked up, her voice was firm but had a touch of nervousness. "Sir Winston Scott, the manager of the New York Continental, told me he had shot John Wick and that he had fallen from the roof of the Continental's terrace. I was there too. I saw him fall, my lord. It was a 4-story hotel." Sirius stood up, his voice became more grave. "Are you stupid? Did you really think an assassin's services end when he falls? Didn't you check the body?" The adjudicator blushed. "No, my lord, he was a man with the reputation of being the most dangerous in the organization. His fall, added to the shots he received, made us think it was impossible for him to survive. Winston Scott's services were in a state of total chaos. There was no time. There are no excuses for failure, adjudicator, exclaimed Sirius. Your negligence has brought disaster upon our organization. Your mission was to ensure that he was dead. It's a sacred duty, and you failed. You have condemned yourself and all of us. Kalen intervened. The adjudicator did everything in her power, you can't blame her. I blame her for everything. Sirius growled, interrupting Kalen. It's not what it seems. She was given a task, and she failed. Get out, adjudicator. The adjudicator, with a glint of anger in her eyes, stood up and left. Your services are suspended until further notice, Sirius yelled, but the woman had already gone. The meeting room fell silent. Sirius sat down again, his body trembling with rage. We have to act fast, he said. Spencer is upping the ante. The members of the high table began to discuss their options. Some advocated for putting all the continental hotels on high alert, others for sending armed member reinforcements to the branches. The tension in the room was palpable, and panic was beginning to invade the minds of the members. This isn't just a reputation problem, said Leilani, her voice a glacial whisper. If it's confirmed that John is alive, and worse, in Spencer's hands, every continental becomes a target. We'll lose trust. We'll lose business. I suggest we declare John excommunicado again, immediately. Let the bounty on him be global. Let it be a clear message to Umbrella. John is your problem now. Leilani, that's what they want, Kalen intervened, with a worried expression. For us to come into the light. If we send our most valuable assets on a public hunt, we'll be dancing to their tune. Discretion is our pillar. We must contact our ghosts, those who operate outside the hotel network. We can't risk the integrity of the Continentals. Kalen is right, Victor nodded. A global hunt would only confirm Spencer's story. It would make us look like a cult, a sect of assassins. The question isn't how we kill John, but how we do it in a way that doesn't drag us down with him. This is all a waste of time. Darian interrupted, slamming his fist on the table. John must be eliminated. We must send our best men to make it clear to that Spencer guy that he doesn't mess with us. John is a defective weapon. He must be destroyed. Sirius raised his hand, stopping the discussion. Enough. Calm down. Panic is Spencer's weapon, not ours. Kalen is right, we can't risk the Continentals. Darian is right on one point. We must respond. But not in the way they expect. Not with a public massacre. He stood up, his eyes fixed on nothing. We need someone who can do all three things: infiltrate, get information, and, if possible, kill John Wick. It's not a mission for a soldier. Victor nodded. We can send Kane. He's a killing machine, a perfect assassin. Sirius shook his head. Kane is too visible. He's a hunter. What we need is a ghost. Someone who can get in and out of Raccoon City without a trace. Someone who isn't affiliated with our organization. Someone who has no ties to the world of assassins. Someone who is willing to risk their life for a reward. An infiltration expert. We need Ada Wong. Ada Wong. Kalen frowned. She's a professional, yes, but her loyalty is to herself. She changes sides as often as the wind. Can we really trust her? She could sell our information to the highest bidder, or worse, to Spencer. Victor added, in a more pragmatic tone. Her price is high, Sirius. She's not the same as any other ghost. If she enters Raccoon City and betrays us, the damage could be catastrophic. Sirius remained firm, his voice a grave whisper. And therein lies her greatest strength. She has no loyalty to anything but her own interests. She doesn't care about our code, she doesn't care about our rules. She won't be tempted to join Spencer for an ideal, only for money. And we have the money. Her mission will be simple. Infiltrate Raccoon City, get information about the T-Virus and Umbrella's plans, and if possible, eliminate John Wick. It's not a mission for a soldier, it's a mission for a ghost. And she is the best of her kind. The high table is entering a dangerous game. But this time, we're going to play by our own rules. The other members nodded. She was the perfect candidate. Ada Wong was a well-known assassin, and furthermore, she was known for being an expert in obtaining information and infiltration. Sirius nodded, and stood up again. He approached his table and dialed a number, this time, to a continental manager in China. The phone rang and rang, until, finally, someone answered. Continental manager in China, what's wrong? The man's voice was a whisper, but Sirius recognized him immediately. I need you to listen carefully, Sirius said. I have a mission for you. And for your best assassin. A mission that could change the fate of our entire organization. The man on the other end of the call seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation. I'm listening, sir. An hour later, September 27th, Shanghai, China. The luxurious apartment in one of Shanghai's tallest skyscrapers was an oasis of calm, a perfect antithesis to the chaos brewing in Ada Wong's world. Dressed in a simple cotton t-shirt and denim shorts that highlighted her long and well-formed legs, she looked radiant. Her hair, short, loose, and shiny, framed the delicate features of her face, accentuating the natural beauty she radiated effortlessly. Ada was lounging on a leather sofa, a steaming cup of tea in her hand. Her attention was divided between a random television show and her own thoughts. On the screen, a handsome man in a tailored suit stood in front of a woman dressed in a princess gown. What superpower would you choose, flying or reading minds? The man asked, a radiant smile on his face. Think about it, flying includes cold. The woman laughed, her voice like a bell. Reading minds, of course. That way I could know if you really love me. The man leaned in, a touch of drama in his gaze. You don't need to read my mind, my love, he told her, his voice a whisper. What I feel for you is written in my heart. Ada scoffed, her eyes rolling. Trivial, she thought. The dialogues are as empty as the lives they try to represent. She imagined herself in that situation, her answer would have been much more practical. Reading minds, she would think. That way I would know if a target is lying. If they've set a trap for me or if I can trust a word they say. There's no room for uncertainty in my world. The plot advanced, the man and the woman kissed, and the screen filled with fireworks. Ada shook her head, a small smile on her face. Love is an illusion, she thought. A weakness. It makes you vulnerable, it makes you predictable. She reflected on the countless times she had seen her colleagues or enemies succumb to their emotions, making fatal mistakes out of loyalty or affection. For her, it was a risk not worth taking. However, she felt a pang of curiosity about what it felt like to be so simple, so normal, so in love, like a tourist observing a distant land to which she could never belong. Would it be comforting, overwhelming? She didn't know. Suddenly, the vibration of her phone broke the bubble of calm. The screen lit up with the name of the continental manager in China. Ada, slightly annoyed by the interruption to her rare moment of peace, swiped her finger to answer. Speak, Ada said, her voice with a tone that made her displeasure clear. Ada, I need you to listen carefully. The manager's voice came through the speaker, a little cautious, as if he were talking to a bomb about to explode. I'm listening, Ada replied with a tone of annoyance. But if you're going to tell me I have to work overtime, you can save your breath. The manager ignored the taunt. I have a mission for you, Ada. From the high table. Ada stood up, her interest, though minimal, had increased. I'm listening, she said as she headed for the kitchen. But if I have to deal with the high table, the reward had better be good. She stopped abruptly to grab 2 slices of bread and a slice of ham. We need you to infiltrate Raccoon City. Specifically, one of Umbrella's laboratories, the manager continued, his voice firm. You must obtain a sample of the T-virus. And there's an additional bonus. If you manage to confirm John Wick's death, the reward will be considerable. Ada's hands, which were making a sandwich, stopped abruptly. John Wick, she asked, her voice with a hint of genuine surprise. I thought he had been killed. How is he alive? He's as alive as you and I, the manager replied with a sigh. According to the information we have, he's in Raccoon City. We don't know how he survived, but he did. Ada was silent for a moment, a half-made sandwich in her hands. Okay, and the reward? How considerable is it? 10 million for the virus sample, the manager said. And 20 million for John Wick. Ada was silent, processing the information. 30 million. It was an exorbitant amount, even for someone like her. The manager, hearing nothing, called out cautiously. Ada. I accept, Ada replied with a speed that surprised even the manager. I'll send you all the information in a few minutes, the manager said, with a tone of relief. The call ended. Ada left the sandwich, which no longer interested her, and walked back to the sofa, her thoughts swirling in her head. John Wick, the man who was supposed to be dead. The world's best assassin. Would it be possible to kill him? A shiver of excitement ran down her spine. A fleeting thought made her smile. Her reflection in the window returned her gaze. Her eyes, though beautiful, hid a touch of danger. Her beauty was her most powerful weapon. She didn't need brute force to defeat John Wick. She could get close to him, gain his trust, and then, when he least expected it, claim the 20 million. He's the best, the ghost of the high table, the legend everyone fears, but his legend is based on violence, she thought. He faces his enemies head-on. I'm different. I won't face him. I'll make him believe I'm on his side. I'll make him believe we're the same. And when he lets his guard down, when he convinces himself he can trust me, then will be the time to act. The idea of using her own strengths against him, of turning her beauty and charm into a weapon as lethal as his pistol, was ironically satisfying to her. Just as she was deep in her thoughts, her phone vibrated again. It was a message. Expecting the manager's information, she opened it, but the sender was another, Albert Wesker. I have a mission for you. I need you to get a sample of the virus. Reward: 4 million. Ada let out a laugh. 2 missions in the same place, on the same day. Wesker's reward was a pittance compared to the high tables, but both had the same objective. She would be content with killing 2 birds with 1 stone. She put the phone aside and headed to her room. Her movements, although delicate, were beautiful and graceful. She took off her casual clothes and took out her combat dress, a bright red dress that highlighted her figure and fit her curves perfectly. She placed her hidden weapons on her legs, small knives and a pair of pistols that were perfectly concealed under the fabric. She looked at herself in the mirror, a small smile on her face as she put on a little makeup, accentuating her features. The high table's money, a total of 30 million, was a good incentive. But the additional bonus, the 20 million for John Wick, was what really excited her. A challenge, an opportunity. It wasn't every day she had the chance to face a myth. Once she put on the dress, she felt her identity as Ada Wong, the assassin, had been restored. She looked at herself in the reflection. And once again, the same idea came to her mind. She would use her beauty. It was her unique weapon, her secret weapon. John Wick was the best assassin, but Ada Wong, with her intellect, charm, and innate talent for seduction, was an opponent he would never expect. She would be the perfect candidate. With one last look in the mirror, Ada made sure everything was in place, headed for the door, and prepared for the hunt. Chapter 20. A Fleeting Respite. September 27th, Raccoon City, 5 p.m. Time did not exist for John Wick, only the cycle of the hunt and survival. After bandaging the wound on his side with improvised cloth, exhaustion settled over him like a heavy blanket. He lay back in the darkest corner of the third-floor room, his back against a cold wall and the adrenaline pulse slowing to a more leisurely pace. Despite his exhaustion, his senses remained on high alert. Every sound, every creak of the building, was a possible omen of danger. However, his body, which had been in constant motion, demanded a brief rest. Fatigue won the battle against paranoia, and his eyes closed, sinking into a light and shallow nap. The brief period of calm was interrupted by distant voices. They were whispers, a conversation that seemed to be coming from the building's first floor. His mind, trained to recognize patterns, immediately analyzed the situation. The abandoned building the taxi driver had shown him was desolate on the outside, but traces of life inside were evident: empty bottles, fresh graffiti, and now, voices. They were intruders, vagrants, perhaps, or urban explorers, he thought. They aren't a problem, unless they see me. The idea of having to deal with innocent civilians was a nuisance. With a swift and silent movement, he stood up. He put his suit back on, which concealed his bandage and allowed him to keep his armor on at all times. His hand went to his silenced pistol, his most loyal companion. With his backpack on his back, containing his equipment and additional ammunition, he moved with unnatural stealth toward the hallway and stopped at the entrance to the stairs. He crouched down, using the wall as cover, and sharpened his hearing to listen more. There were several voices, from a group of at least 4 people, judging by the tone and volume. Their words, indistinct at first, became clearer as they approached. A moment later, the voices became alarmed. "What's that strong smell?" said a man's voice, with a tone of disgust. "Yeah, it smells awful. Like something rotten," another replied, with a hint of disgust in his voice. John, with annoyance spreading across his face, remembered the taxi driver. He had left him dead on the second floor. The stench of the corpse had undoubtedly been what had alerted the newcomers. They were nothing more than curious people, but they could call the police, and the police, in this city, were umbrella. He couldn't allow it. He heard footsteps coming up the stairs, and the conversation became more audible. "This is crazy, we shouldn't be here," said a trembling voice. "Come on, it's just a smell, what's the worst that can happen?" replied another, with a braver tone. The footsteps stopped abruptly on the second floor. A tense silence took over the place. The stench is stronger there, John thought. They're going to find him. The idea of his presence becoming known bothered him. He wanted to be invisible. Suddenly, a sharp scream echoed through the building, followed by a chorus of terror-filled exclamations. "Run, run, there's a fucking dead guy here," a voice shouted, its breath ragged. "We shouldn't have come, I told you. Damn it, I told you." Another replied, his voice trembling with fear. "We have to call the police. Now, we have to warn someone." A third demanded, the panic palpable in her tone. "Oh my God, his face, for God's sake. Let's get out of here, fast." John sighed, an almost inaudible sound that was lost in the air. It was inevitable. He would have to move. He couldn't let them see him, and he couldn't let them alert the authorities. Using the darkness as his cloak of invisibility, he moved away from the building. He entered the alleys, a labyrinth of trash and shadows that offered an escape from curious glances. The main streets, full of people, were not a safe place for him. The alleys, while not a total refuge, were less crowded. As he moved, dodging garbage bags and puddles of water, his mind remained on alert. He saw a couple of homeless people sleeping on cardboard. In a garbage can, he found a broken umbrella. It had small holes in the fabric, which was probably why it had been discarded, but for John, it was perfect. He could use it to hide his face and go unnoticed in the crowd. He took it and opened it, holding it so that it covered his face, like an improvised mask. As he walked, his thoughts focused on a place to spend the night. He looked at his watch, 5:35 p.m. Nightfall would come soon, and with it, danger. Darkness was not always an ally, especially if you were in Umbrella's sights. At a turn in the alley, he saw two men. They were smoking, and the sweet smell floating in the air confirmed what they were. John hurried. He didn't need unnecessary problems. Not now, not while he could avoid them. With the umbrella covering his face, he kept a hand close to his pistol. He was 2 meters from them when one whispered to the other. "Hey, look at that guy. So well dressed, with that backpack and that suit. This is a stroke of luck, brother. He probably has money, enough to buy a couple of doses for the whole week," said the other, with a toothless smile. John, oblivious to the whisper, continued on his way. When he was about to pass them, a voice stopped him. "Hey, you, stop. Got the time?" John stopped. A sigh of annoyance escaped him. He raised his wrist, looked at his watch, and without turning around, he replied. "It's 5:35 in the afternoon." He turned to leave, but the other man called him again. Both of them were approaching him. "Don't go so fast, friend. That watch, it's very nice," one said, his eyes fixed on the piece. "I wonder how much it's worth. I bet it's what his dad's suit cost," the other joked, laughing. The sigh of resignation that escaped John was almost a groan. He didn't have time for this. He couldn't afford a street altercation. Not when the whole city was looking for him. Every second he spent here was one more second for people to recognize him and alert Umbrella. He couldn't risk being seen. A sigh, he lifted the umbrella a little to see the two idiots who dared to stand in his way. Both men, seeing his cold, lifeless gaze, were petrified. Their smiles vanished, their eyes widened in shock, as if they had seen death in person. And so it was. Without a single word, without a sigh, John Wick took his silenced pistol from his suit. He aimed and fired. 2 shots, 2 headshots. The bodies fell to the ground without a sound. The silencer had done its job, and the only witnesses to the scene were the piles of trash in the shadows. The two men didn't have time to react. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. John, without a single hint of remorse, put his weapon away and continued on his way, with the umbrella still covering his face, as if nothing had happened. The blood on the sidewalk mixed with the rainwater that began to fall, slowly and gradually. The sky had darkened, as an omen of the danger that was approaching. John, imperturbable, continued on his way. The umbrella he had taken, although defective, had become his only protection against the gaze of the people. Drops of water filtered through the small holes, wetting his hair and face, but he didn't care. His mind was an impenetrable fortress, focused on one thing, survival. As he advanced, John's internal thoughts swirled, a whirlwind of decisions that had to be made. The police, and therefore Umbrella, already knew he was in the city. He had to find a safe place, a hiding place where he could spend the night and plan his next move. He thought of several places. An abandoned building, a hotel, a hospital, but they were all too obvious. They could be watched, or worse, already controlled by Umbrella. He needed something different, a place where no one would look for a man like him. As he walked, he blended in with the crowd, who were taking out their umbrellas to protect themselves from the rain. John's umbrella allowed him to go unnoticed, just one more shadow among many. He heard fragments of conversations, whispers that confirmed the situation in the city. "Did you hear the news?" A woman next to him said. "The mayor is going to make a monument in honor of the children who died at the school." "Yes, I saw the news. It's terrible. What a monster could do something like that," another replied, with a tone full of repulsion. "And what a coincidence, tomorrow. They will do it at the school itself. What an honorable act on the part of our mayor." John didn't pay attention to them. People's rumors, the news, public opinion, he didn't care. People thought he was a monster. It wasn't the first time he had done it, and it wouldn't be the last. After all, he was John Wick, a killer. His eyes, in search of a refuge, fell on something unusual. A paper boat, floating in the current of water that the rain had formed on the sidewalk. The small boat sailed for a couple of meters until it stopped, right next to a sewer. Suddenly, a brilliant idea, a revelation, came to him. The sewers. They were an underground labyrinth, the city's network of veins. They could be his sanctuary, his personal highway to move undetected. The idea was perfect. It was the last place anyone would look for John Wick. With a new goal in mind, John headed to an alley. He found a less visible manhole cover, partially hidden by a pile of trash. Quickly, he knelt, leaving his backpack and umbrella aside, and looked for something metallic to pry with. He found a rusty metal bar and, with minimal effort, lifted the heavy lid. A gust of dense, nauseating air hit his face. A smell of human waste and mold, an aroma so intense that it made him wrinkle his face in disgust. Quickly, he threw his backpack inside, followed closely, and closed the umbrella. With the same silence that characterized him, he went down the stairs. Once his feet touched the ground, he let go of the umbrella and left it aside. He closed the manhole cover again and put on his backpack. The contrast with the surface was abysmal. The darkness was almost total, only broken by the light of a flashlight in his hand. The air seemed scarce and the stench was almost unbearable, but John didn't care. He had been in much worse places. "It's not the Continental Suite, that's for sure," he thought with a bitter irony, as his eyes adapted to the darkness. "But it's safe, and that's all that matters right now." The sewers were a world apart. The stench of damp and decomposition clung to his clothes and skin, a constant reminder that he was underground, in the bowels of a city about to collapse. The darkness was almost total, only broken by the beam of his flashlight. His footsteps echoed on the cement, an echo that was lost in the immensity of the labyrinth. As he walked, John came to a tunnel that forked. One path led to a dead end, and the other to a steel door. The door was imposing, with a logo engraved in the center, the shape of an umbrella. His mind, a file of information on the criminal world, activated. Umbrella, the pharmaceutical company that controlled the city, the same one that had founded the city's police force, the same name he had been hearing on the Raccoon radio. John couldn't help but feel a pang of surprise. The company, a front pharmaceutical corporation, had laboratories underground. He approached the door, his hand on the handle. It was closed. John moved around the place, and noticed something. A generator, air ducts, a ventilation system. It was a life support system, and that meant there were people. Just as John was about to go back, he heard voices in the background. They were two men. He hid in the darkness, his silenced pistol in hand, a ghost waiting in the shadows. "Did you hear the news?" said one of the voices. "The mayor is going to make a monument at the school. A waste of time and resources. Why doesn't he do it in our name? After all, we're the ones who are going to save the city." "It's a front, a public relations act," the other voice replied. "Umbrella doesn't care about the mayor. It cares about progress, science. We'll see the company's true face. We have all the control of this city." John, with a calm that came from years of experience, observed the two men. Both wore black combat uniforms, with the umbrella logo on their chests. They were carrying MP5 submachine guns, and they moved with the confidence of those who believed they were alone. John waited for the moment. The first soldier went forward and John, with a movement as fast and silent as a snake, moved behind him. He wrapped his arm around the soldier's throat and put his hand over his mouth. The soldier barely had time to react before John took him into the shadows, dragging him into the darkness of the alley. The other soldier, not hearing his companion, turned to see what was happening, but it was already too late. John, who moved with an inhuman speed, had him in his sights. He shot him in the knee, and the man fell to the ground, his scream muffled by the sound of the silencer. Quickly, with a fluid movement, John kicked his hands, disarming him. The man, writhing in pain on the ground, looked at him. Despite the gloom, he recognized the figure. "So you're the asshole who messed with Umbrella," he said with a sarcastic smile, full of contempt and pain. John did not flinch. The provocation was nothing more than noise. His voice was a low and dangerous whisper. "What is Umbrella doing here, in the sewers?" The soldier let out a painful laugh, which turned into a grimace of agony. "Go to hell," he snapped. John's patience ran out. He put his weapon away, grabbed the man by the collar of his uniform, and dragged him a few meters, toward the stream of wastewater that circulated in the center of the tunnel. The soldier paled, his smile disappeared. He understood John's intentions. "Last chance," John said, his gaze fixed on the soldier's terrified eyes. "Answer my questions or I'll give you a shit water bath until you swallow it." The man remained silent, but his hand moved stealthily to the side of his leg. John, with his keen sense of observation, suspected it was a hidden weapon. He didn't waste time. He took out his pistol and fired. The silencer muffled the sound of the shot, and the soldier's hand exploded in a bloody hole, blood gushing from the wound. The soldier screamed, a scream of pure, visceral pain that mixed with the sound of the water. John, tired and in a hurry, told him, "You asked for it." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed him by the neck with force. The soldier, his face a mask of terror, screamed, "No, please, stop." But John didn't listen. With brutal speed, he plunged his entire head into the stream of wastewater. The stench and taste of the filth flooded him. He thrashed in a panic, but John held him with an iron grip. After about 30 seconds, he pulled him out of the water. The stench of shit was overwhelming. "Looks like you'll have to take a bath," John said with a mocking tone. The man couldn't take it anymore. He turned around and started vomiting, bile and dirty water mixing on the ground. John stepped back a little, waiting. When the soldier finished, he turned to look at John, his eyes full of fear and pain. John asked him again, with no emotion in his voice, "Are you going to answer or do you want another bath?" The soldier, with a trembling voice, screamed, "No, please. Don't put me in the water again. I'll only do it if you lie to me or don't answer my questions," John replied coldly. What do you want to know?" the soldier said, hurried and nervous. "I already asked," John said, his voice impassive. "What is Umbrella doing here? And is the mayor involved?" The soldier, without hesitation, responded quickly, releasing the information as if it were an overflowing river. Umbrella and the mayor work together, along with the city's police chief. These sewers lead to an underground Umbrella laboratory, which is under the direction of Dr. William Birkin. John, upon hearing that name again, showed a flash of interest in his eyes. "Birkin," he whispered to himself. Then, his attention returned to the man. "Do you know how to get to the laboratory?" "No, I don't know," the soldier replied, his voice broken. The coldness on John's face hardened. "Looks like you want to take another dip, huh?" The soldier screamed, "I really don't know." But John didn't pay attention to him. With a firm hand, he submerged him in the water again. The man tried to hold his breath, but the water got into his ears, and the discomfort and lack of oxygen forced him to open his mouth. After another 30 seconds, John pulled him out. The man vomited again, the stench of shit mixing with the vomit. John stepped aside, observing him. The man looked at him with extreme fear and said as fast as he could, "I don't know where the Umbrella laboratory is. We are in charge of securing the supplies that arrive from the hospital and transporting certain test subjects. There is another team that is in charge of transporting those supplies to the laboratory." John, upon hearing that explanation, seemed a little convinced. "Why didn't you say that before?" he said, his tone mocking. "Is it because you've gotten a taste for that water?" The man, with anger, replied, "I didn't have time to say that." John asked another question. "How do you get to where your job is, to secure the supplies, and how many soldiers are there?" "This way, sir," the soldier exclaimed, quickly pointing down the tunnel to the left. "Follow the main tunnel, you will pass 2 side tunnels and at the 3rd tunnel, turn right. There is an access grate that leads outside, to an alley. Our post is about 100 meters from there." There are about 20 soldiers, I swear. John nodded with the information. One last question, he said. Is that all? The man, nervously, nodded, saying that was all he knew. John stood up. The soldier, with pleading eyes, asked, "Are you going to kill me?" John didn't answer. He just took out his weapon and shot him in the head. Without hesitation, the man died in less than 2 seconds. John crouched down. There was no time for regrets or pity. With a quick movement, he took the fallen soldier's MP5 submachine gun. He crossed the nylon strap it had over his chest, so the weapon hung from his body, ready to be used. Then, he checked the ammunition of both soldiers. The bloody hands of the second man, the one he had just killed, were full of cartridges. John took them all, and placed them on his belt, arranging them in the empty compartments he had. Next, he took the MP5 and checked it, making sure the safety was on, the magazine was full, and the barrel was clean. All in order. With a confident step, John headed toward the tunnel the soldier had indicated, disappearing again into the darkness of the sewers. To be continued.